The feeling was embarrassment. He was sure of it. A fresh wave of agony drove all thought from his mind, and he fought to break free with wild, involuntary strength. Though with his brother's weight pinning him to the carpet, all that happened was a momentary spasm. "Squirmin', Herman!" Aloysius scolded, his smug grin almost audible. "Hold still for once. You'll get blood all over Mother's new Turkish carpet." "Then you should have waited till I went out to the kitchen, you ass!" Herman thought savagely, before reaching again for the quiet place in the center of his mind, the one place the pain didn't touch. He could write it out. He could keep his will focused and come out the other side of this with enough left of himself to rebuild. But it was embarrassing, humiliating to be so easily bested, the weakling of the family, fruit of inferior blood and Mother's self-indulgent. Vicious as he was, oldest son Aloysius still had a long way to go to catch up with her mother's flesh-carving prowess. Even if he had finally mastered Madame Fuller's favorite trick of paralyzing the larynx, so the flesh in question couldn't beg for mercy, or argue, or scream. Seconds passed like hours, his brother's cold hands fumbling around in the gash he'd pulled open at the base of Herman's neck. Carotid, got it. He reached further in, pinched something between his thumb and forefinger, and bracing his other hand between Herman's shoulders, began to pull. Thought swept away under a tidal wave of pain. The mind called Herman Hortenus Fuller was a burning tightrope, a taut thread strung across an ocean of suffering flesh, silence shredding in its grip. After a minute, or a year, he came back to himself, blinking tear-swollen eyes, and drew a few deep breaths, not wanting to test whether his voice worked just yet. Aloysius sat next to him, camp-style, chin propped up in one blood-drenched hand. "Well, would you look at that? It worked, and you managed not to soil the rug after all." Herman hawked up a mouthful of spit, shakily raising himself up on one elbow. If he hadn't yet decided whether to aim at the floor or his brother, when he felt something tighten around his neck. A wave of blackness momentarily clouded his vision. Aloysius' grin of delight fading in and out of focus. "Oh, that worked perfectly. And it's your own skin to boot, so with your collar turned up, no one will ever notice the difference. Come on." He sprang to his feet, reaching down to haul Herman up by the arm. Herman swatted his hand away weakly and used the leg of a nearby chair to haul himself up. "Hurts more when Mother does it," he growled, standing all the way up with a grimace, gratified to hear his own voice again, even if it broke. "Then why are you crying?" "Make you feel better. Wouldn't want Mother's golden boy to get discouraged." Aloysius smirked and turned to head for the library's door, expecting his brother to follow. He held his right arm carefully near his chest to avoid dripping blood on the upholstery. At 17, Herman was already bulkier than either of his siblings, though most of it was muscle. Aloysius was lanky and wickedly fast, and willowy Lucretia seemed to float rather than walk. But muscles weren't much use when one of his family members could render him weak as a kitten with a touch. Sharing half of their blood made him more susceptible to the magic, not less. With a well-timed kick, Herman slammed the library door against his brother's backside, making the older boy trip over his feet and stumble gracelessly into the opposite wall. He palmed a letter opener from the nearby writing desk, testing its balance as the door slammed open. "You little," his brother snarled, tried to snatch a hooded lantern off the wall. His eyes narrowed in concentration. Herman felt the writhing end of the coil around his neck creep upward. It tugged on the skin under his jaw, forcing his mouth open. This is gonna be bad, he thought, gripping the tiny blade. A mild, melodious voice drifted down the hall. Boys, what's that racket? Both young men froze. They locked eyes, and with identical expressions of wariness, each slowly put down the improvised weapon he was holding. Very sorry to have disturbed you, Mother, Aloysius called out. We will join you momentarily. Hastily, they checked to be sure their shirts were laced, their doublets buttoned, their hair smoothed as they proceeded towards the salon. At an angry gargle from the younger boy, Aloysius waved a hand, and the new coil of flesh lifted dozens of delicate feelers out of the anchoring skin and tiptoed back down to settle in its original location. Herman gnashed his teeth experimentally and wished for a glass of water, or he amended, gazing at the back of his brother's blond head, perhaps a revolver. The salon at the front of the house faced the street and was every bit as sumptuously appointed as the library. Two of the female servants sat discreetly in a corner with a basket of mending. The gas lamps along the avenue had been lit for the evening, adding strength to the fading autumn sun. Mother looked up from her chair by the fireplace as the boys entered. Her gaze was cool and thoughtful. Lucretia, sleeves rustling, set aside the book of poems she had been reading, a gleam of mischief in her eye. This, Herman thought again, is going to be bad. With a small nod, Mother acknowledged their presence, her attention on Aloysius' bloodied right forearm and chin. Where were you boys playing this time? The library, Mother. Her eyebrow quirked, and Aloysius added hastily, Everything's intact. We were very careful. We? Herman retorted. Lucretia held the back of her hand over her mouth, hiding a snicker. Madame Fuller sat up in her chair, looking over her shoulder to the servants. Sarah, she said quietly. The young woman set her needlework aside and stood, dropping a curtsy. Yes, ma'am. Her soft steps swept around the brothers, and she slipped from the room, dark face composed, eyes downcast. Now then, what have you to show me? Wordlessly, Aloysius reached over and untied the string that fastened his brother's shirt. Herman scowled but did not protest. He had, after all, failed to prevent it, and fighting back now would only irritate their mother. Lucretia sprang from her seat and drifted over to the boys, peering at the modification with interest. He ran her fingers around the coil and tugged at it experimentally. Despite himself, Herman flinched, which won him a flicker of a smile. How diverting, she exclaimed, like a little serpent. And is that? She closed her eyes and sniffed a moment. Is that arterial blood? The carotid, Aloysius replied, trying hard not to look smug, so that when it tightens, it cuts off blood flow to the brain, bringing on a faint very quickly. He demonstrated this. Darkness clouded Herman's vision, and he struggled for breath. Hands clutching at his throat, the sound of a crash floated dimly through the haze, and he realized he had been the sound of it himself, crumpling to the floor. And you put it on the outside? Lucretia's tone was faintly scornful as she prodded Herman with a silk-clad toe. Once again, he clambered awkwardly to his feet. He wished, and not for the first time, that he could have managed to pick up the servants' knack of keeping dread and murderous anger from showing on their faces. Aloysius looked nonplussed. Then again, Lucretia had mastered the art of seating her modifications not only within the body, but somehow elsewhere several years ago, and loved to tweak her older sibling's pride. I had thought, he replied, we could adapt this for general use, perhaps after amending it as you describe. Even the factory workers could benefit from this kind of motivation. Madame Fuller sighed. She waved Lucrezia back towards her previous seat on the divan, then folded her hands in her lap. I appreciate your enthusiasm, Aloysius. I really do. But I worry that the protections of this house have made you injudicious. We answer to none but ourselves, of course. But to indulge oneself in a manner that is wasteful of resources creates vulnerability. A man, her voice grows sterner, must solve his own dilemmas, must think plans through before enacting them. Sarah returned as quietly as she had left, holding a bloodied cloth in one hand. Madame Fuller looked at it with a frown. Where? On the lantern in the hallway, ma'am. Nowhere else. She preferred the rag, which the lady grasped by the edge, before turning to toss it in the fire. With another small curtsy, Sarah went back to her seat by the basket of mending. Aloysius's mouth opened in a silent rictus, his body quivering as wisps of smoke curled up from his face and hand, as embers lit and smote on his bespattered shirt. His mother rose and walked over to him, footsteps heavy in the quiet room. He patted the unmarked side of his face with a slim white hand. My dear sweet boy, I value you. I want you to succeed, to overcome, and I want you to remember you have power. You will always have enemies, even among those who serve and fear you. Do not fall into the trap of thinking you are safe. No one is safe from us, not even God, if we fulfill our destiny. Therefore, we, in turn, cannot believe we are safe from anyone. Will you remember? As quickly as it began, the heat dissipated. Gasping, Aloysius raised his cracked and blistering hand before his face, struggling to heal it as he spoke. Yes, mother. Thank you, mother. I will remember. Good, my child. Very good. She beamed at him and reached up to tousle his hair. And I am pleased to see you are experimenting with new techniques. Madame Fuller turned to Herman, her smile taking on a tinge of pity as she clasped him by the shoulders. My poor baby, were you able to alter it at all? He managed not to grind his teeth. No, mother. I hadn't tried it yet. Shame roiled in his belly. Shame that she expected so little of him, and still he had failed her. He had talent, but it came to him more slowly. He needed time. He needed to concentrate to make it worse. Physical violence was much easier, and he knew as long as he had the advantage of surprise, he could do significant damage. Not that it mattered. Do you know the range on it? Lucrezia mused idly, fingers twirling a lock of her hair. If you were in the cellar, for example, or the stables, would it still work? That is an excellent question, my daughter. Let us put it to the test. Horses stamped and whickered in the gathering dark. Herman rubbed his hands together, musing, as he often did, that a good strong horse was worth more than he was. Son of the house or no, if he took one and ran, it would be for the horse's sake that they were followed. A now damnably familiar tightness at his throat brought Herman back to the present, and he looked up. Curtains twitched, and he recognized his brother's silhouette in the kitchen window. This time, though, Herman was prepared, and he fought back against the wave of disorientation to concentrate on the little snake around his neck, on the heat of his blood running through it, willing its grip to loose. It eased, just a bit. He took a few steps backward, angling for the courtyard gate. It eased just a bit more. Step By step, like a mouse inching towards its burrow, under the watchful eye of a cat, Herman slunk out onto the road. He turned and started walking down the lane without much thought. Something in him soured at the idea of going back up to the house. Out here, the air was crisp and cool, clouds scudding over a waning moon in the quiet of evening. Passers-by saw his fine coat and hat and his thunderous scowl, and more often than not, nervously stepped aside, despite his obvious youth. Their deference was a balm to his shattered pride. Herman realized he could, if he chose, simply keep walking on his own 2 feet. In that sense, he supposed he was lucky. If one of what Mother termed the lessers were to flee with a head full of family secrets, they would more than likely meet Lucrezia on a lonely midnight lane. Her insides were far, far bigger than her outside, and he had no desire whatsoever to know how many things had once been people she had already collected there. And besides, he had to be discreet, for his own protection. Those who fed upon the power of Yaldabaoth had many enemies, of course. Any one of the rival families who'd been drifting north and east in the wake of the war would love to lay hands on even the least of Mother's offspring. And if he came to that, if he let himself be captured, she would never forgive him. His thoughts had carried him past the wealthier district where the Fuller house stood, past a row of more modest homes, to the foot of a bridge that led to the factories on the other side of the river. Reflected torchlight flickered on the water, and Herman squinted into the distance. Someone had set up a tent on a rough patch of ground next to one of the docks. Curiosity quickened his steps across the bridge. It was indeed a tent. 2 young men, not much older than himself, stood stationed at the entrance, but were too focused on whatever was happening inside to pay Herman much heed. A man's voice rose over the murmuration of the crowd. "What praise is sufficient for such a gift? What glory can we, in our wretchedness, bestow upon the One who sheds His glory upon us?" The murmuration swelled in approval. Herman stepped forward, lips parting with fascination. His family attended church services every Sunday. No person of their social standing could avoid it. Those were deadly, dull, formulaic rituals cast entirely into shadow by the bloody and far more potent practices with which the Fullers siphoned might from the raw, undulating vastness they called God. One of the boys by the entrance grinned at Herman encouragingly and lifted the tent flap. So, along with the preacher's calls and the crowd's responses, the smell of human throng drifted out to meet him. Breath, sweat, and pheromones. "The power of the blood is the mercy of the Lord." Amen. "The power of the blood is the mercy of the Almighty." Amen. I say again, I can't hear you. I said the power of the blood is the mercy of our Lord Jesus Christ. Amen. His carving may have been shamefully inadequate, but Herman's nose was almost as good as his sister's. The body-warmed air of the revival tent swirled with a riot of emotions leaking through the congregation's pores. They were hungry, anxious, desperate, horny, lonely, grubby animals. But at this moment, swept up in the preacher's words at this moment, almost none of them were afraid. His world had always turned on an axis of fear. Fear of the pain he'd already endured and dread of the pain yet to come. But if someone held the power to take a person's fear away, to dangle the irresistible lure of hope and mercy, didn't that person, just as certain, show himself to be the master of their fear, the one they would follow and obey? The thought struck him like lightning. Brother Fuller, I wonder if you might lend me your countenance this morning. Herman finished drying his face with a towel and caught Samuel Winter's eye in the piece of polished metal the caravan used for a mirror. The Reverend's eyes were crinkling a bit at the edges, his broad-brimmed hat tilted in the wan pre-dawn light. A good sign. Winter, in an expansive mood, was more pliable and less apt to sermonize. "It's my honor as always to accompany you, Brother Winter. Only let me fetch my coat." Though Samuel Winter's own hue, through a quirk of genetics, was as pale as a cloud in a summer sky, his features proclaimed his African ancestry. This combination was useful in drawing a crowd and holding their attention. News of Winter's arrival brought the curious as well as the penitent to the revival tent, regardless of who lived there. In many situations, however, it put the senior preacher at something of a disadvantage, despite his personal gravitas. By contrast, Herman had a way with words, an air of barely restrained menace, and was unambiguously white. His own understanding of who constituted the superior race was based on an entirely different set of measurements, and he exploited his advantages ruthlessly. Keeping the caravan costs down in humdrum transactions like wrangling with city clerks and buying supplies added up to more money than they could spend on making the services more interesting, and they were almost flush enough to buy a bigger tent. Traffic on the avenue was sparse and businesslike at this hour, mostly carts bearing perishable goods from the farms to the south towards the center of the town. Everyone seemed determined to be cheerful and plow all their memories of the war into the soil, as the soil itself had already swallowed the blood and the ashes. The creak of wheels and the plodding of draft animals blended in with the songs of distant birds. "I must say, Herman, your message on the miracle of the loaves and fishes has become quite the crowd pleaser. All to the glory of the Lord." Winter smiled, but his glance was shrewd. "There are times I wonder, my young friend, if your ambition is to see how many bodies you can pack into that tent, is drowning out the still, small voice of our Savior in our heart. A hungry mind is a distracted mind, brother, and the more sheep we bring into the fold, the more who may have ears to hear the gospel of truth," he replied, mouth running on reflex while his mind raced to catch up. This was a new topic. He wondered what Winter was getting at. In their previous discussions, he always warmed to Herman's enthusiasm for concocting new tweaks and innovations to the service. "I don't doubt your energy or your ability. My concern at this moment is with the peace of your spirit, with understanding the motivation that led you to the Lord's service." His shrug was eloquent. "Unlike many of those who travel with me, you had other options, and this seems like a propitious time to inquire." There was a long pause. Herman chewed on his lip and waited it out. He couldn't spin a counter-argument until he understood what he'd done that the preacher found troublesome. "Forgive me if I intrude on a delicate matter, but it seems your dreams have been less troubled of late." Herman's eyes shot up, and almost without realizing it, he let out his breath in a long, slow whistle. That was definitely new. For long months after joining Brother Winter, he'd been too caught up in learning the ropes of his new, fast-paced new life to think about much else. After Herman admitted to himself he'd been too self-conscious at first to even approach his most pressing problem. The night Herman had left home, his older brother, Aloysius, had used the flesh-carving talents that ran in their family to wrap a snake-like coil of Herman's own skin around his neck, and had used it as a choke collar to torment the younger boy. Herman had been conceived with a continental acquaintance, an ordinary man whose name no one ever saw fit to tell him, at their mother's husband's funeral. Outliving her mate had put Madame Fuller in a decadent, festive mood. In the eyes of the mundane world, the boy was legitimate, the last child of the senior Mr. Fuller, who had died in a tragic hunting accident. But it was known among their own secretive community that Madame Fuller had flouted custom and gone outside their carefully curated bloodlines to flaunt her own power. She had survived the attack by a rival clan that had claimed her husband's life, and those who had opposed her were now her cultivars. This meant Herman had inherited considerably less talent in sensing and shaping the hidden potential of living flesh than either of his siblings, and no one outside his immediate family would condescend to teach him. The sheet of canvas separating his tent from that of the next man had seemed too thin, his own ability so paltry that there was no chance he could work on it quickly or painlessly. Once he grew confident enough to try, he came to understand Mother's draconian insistence on cleanliness in fleshcraft in a whole new light. The snake was fed from one of the major arteries in his neck, and working on it on himself in the dark by touch would have been much messier without a set of reflexes honed by years of terror. The caravan did their laundry communally. Herman had employed considerable ingenuity to be able to wash the one rag he dared to sacrifice to the task without calling anyone else's attention to the suspiciously large amounts of blood. The bigger problem was that it wanted, for lack of a better word, to remain in place. His brother Aloysius was older and had had more lessons and was, damn him, full-blooded. He could make the thing get up and dance with a stern glance and a wave of his elegant hand. Herman, however, needed peace and quiet and total concentration to fumble his way into the power. He would start at the narrow tip every time, tugging at the delicate, questing tendrils up bit by bit, careful to break as few as possible. If they broke, they bled. If they touched his skin elsewhere, they sank in and clung. And long days of traveling, breaking camp, setting up camp, doing chores, preaching sermons, and sitting through endless discussions of a God whose flesh none of them had actually tasted, left him too worn out for more than a brief struggle. It had taken him the better part of a year to reach the night where he peeled it up, stretched it out to almost its full length, and laid it flat down the center of his chest. In poor light, he could almost pass it off as a scar. The next day, he had surreptitiously tossed the fraying, bloody rag into the morning campfire. Watching it burn had been one of the happiest moments of his life. And truthfully, in the weeks since, he had slept deeply and dreamed not at all. He hadn't realized winter had heard him, had interpreted Herman's tears of pain and frustrations as the groanings of a troubled soul. The other young men in the crew tended to be awake in the small hours wrestling an entirely different sort of snake, though they had, for the most part, learned to be quiet about it. The decision to leave my family was not an easy one, he said, leaving out the implications as he spoke. Risky to tell too much truth, or too little. The evils of avarice, the temptations of the flesh. I wanted to make a clean break and set myself on a more righteous path. But my heart was conflicted. Even if your absence did not leave them in want, you know that you are still your brother's keeper. Winter sighed, clasping his hands behind his back, and to wonder whether your calling is true, or you have merely run from your responsibilities. That is a heavy burden for any man's heart to bear. My brother was my keeper, Herman growled, surprising himself with his vehemence. If I had stayed, I would have been his puppet, marching to his tune. He shook his head. The only roads worth taking lead away from that place. The town had grown denser and more bustling as they walked. Winter stopped at the shallow wooden steps that led up to the courthouse. King Daniel descended into the den of lions, and they did him no harm, for the Lord was with him. Herman closed his eyes, deliberately willing his fist to unclench. "Brother," he said after a moment, "your faith is greater than mine." The permit fee was reasonable for a change. Even better, the chatty city clerk had been more than happy to give him tips on which local grocers, Wainwrights, and farriers would gouge them the least. After a short stop at the postal service counter to pick up the twine-wrapped bundle of the caravan's mail, Herman strolled back to the lobby with a spring in his step. To his surprise, he found Winter deep in conversation with a dapper stranger who looked to be in his mid-20s. He had an English face, a Virginia accent, and a hat and suit in the height of New York fashion that would have set them back the price of another 3 wagons. Herman liked him instantly and instantly distrusted the feeling. A man he perceived as a kindred spirit was no one you wanted to turn your back on. "Brother Fuller, I trust our business went well?" "Can't complain," Winter chuckled. "A wise decision. I have been pleased to make the acquaintance of Mr. Carter here. Mr. Carter, Herman Fuller, my apprentice and right-hand man." "Mr. Fuller, delighted to meet you, sir." He extended a hand to Herman. "Hezekiah Carter at your service. Zeke to my friends. I was just telling the Reverend that I consider this meeting fortuitous in the extreme." Herman shook hands absently, trusting his nose to pick up on the subtext. Under the urbane exterior, Zeke was a man who had been at the long, frayed edge of his patience. "How might our humble traveling church be able to assist you, Brother Carter?" "Straight to the point," he flashed a disarming smile. "My uncle's business recently acquired the manufacturing and distribution rights to a new kind of electric loudspeaking device. We had a small demonstration all set up for the next town hall meeting, but, well, some internal rivalries on the city council seemed to have slammed the door on us at the last moment. My uncle wanted a test of the device under field conditions with a dash of local publicity, and may I say he is a man who values results." "And what will it cost us to help you produce these results?" There had been genuine fear in that bit about his uncle, Herman judged. Maybe this wasn't some hotshot grifter. Winter frowned and seemed to object, but Carter broke in. No, that's an entirely fair question. I'd have asked the same. We expect a short speech on the wonderful new equipment on loan from Carter Premium Acquisitions, and for the loudspeaker to be used throughout the night service. What's in it for you? Assurance that the device works as expected under field conditions, and publicity which might attract potential buyers. Not, he glanced apologetically at the Reverend, that the workaday worshippers at a migratory revival tent are our usual class of customer. Tomorrow's town hall meeting was to have had some local attendees of considerable influence. But you draw a crowd, you're highly public, you're all I can get in a pinch, and I'm due back at home office in 2 weeks. I'm inclined to accept this generous offer, Winter said firmly. Herman acknowledged with a slight nod. It was Winter's operation and his call. It seems a wholesome and beneficial addition to our evening, and we'll be doing our neighbor a kindness in his hour of need. That's magnificent news, Reverend. You'll have my gratitude. I'll alert my assistants at once. If you'll be willing, Brother Winter, I'd like to go along with Zeke to see this loudspeaker myself and consult with him on how to arrange it for best advantage, Herman said, sorting out the mail as he spoke. If there was more going on here than met the eye, he didn't intend to let Carter out of his sight, if he could help it. All of a sudden, he froze, staring down at the mail in his hands as if it had just grown fangs and bit him. Here, among invoices and advertisements and letters from grateful attendees, was an envelope that looked utterly out of place. The heavy cream paper, his name written out, C.O., Brother Winter's Revival Caravan of Hope and Mercy. The familiar, looping calligraphy. Mother. Herman recovered rapidly enough. He hoped to avoid notice, but he barely heard his mentor's agreeable reply as he turned to toss the advertisements in a dustbin, slipping the letter into an inside pocket, body shielding the moment. How had she found him? Why had she bothered after all this time? She'd been fond of him, of course, as the living symbol of her own ascendance to the head of the family, which had in turn precipitated her rise to preeminence in the shrunken circle of American practitioners of Nalka who survived the Civil War, but he'd never actually been of use to her, nor had there been much hope that this would change. Aloysius, beside his otherworldly talents, had a healthy amount of ambition and ruthless cunning, and Lucrezia was so far above him they'd stopped bothering to test each other. Herman could not for the life of him imagine what Mother wanted, yet it might be worse than fatal to refuse her. Carter grinned at him again, rifling through a few letters of his own as they exited the courthouse. His speculative gaze promised aggravating questions. Whatever the other man thought was the cause of Herman's unease, it apparently amused him. At least someone was amused. He did not have time for this right now. That letter had probably been in the mail for months. He could wait a few days to read it. Miles away from here. In private. Inwardly, Herman began to curse in every language he knew. Cousin Zeke, sorry to have sent you on a wild goose chase like this. If you're reading this, you're better than halfway home, and it looks like you'll have to do quality testing on the way back rather than use the labs here. Father says to run this through the front company. As far as the men in our department can tell from the documents we got, this one will work as advertised. Father needs tangible proof before he can even suggest it to the other partners for his upcoming project. The Fairfax City Council are small fry. I did what I could with them, but this area doesn't have much of interest for us. We've heard Mitterling will be there, though. Get to him if you can. Rumor has it his mechanical innovations are something out of the common way. I'd rather get him thinking it's his own idea to come work for us before Father does something rash. Reliable engineers are hard to come by, and if this loudspeaker doesn't work, Marshall boys are likely to pay this lot a visit. It would be best to have a replacement lined up beforehand. I've sent copies of everything I've got that might help you. Keep it close and be careful. The whole reason Mitterling's relocating is he's had a rash of thefts and vandalism at his previous workshop. My best guess, based on local intelligence, is he used to be a more orthodox disposition, and his former friends consider him a heretic. Hope to see you soon and in the best of health, for both of us. Justice Carter. Today, in the itinerary Justice had sent, was marked down for making a series of calls to what passed for influential men in the area. Hezekiah had planned to discuss the upcoming town hall meeting with them, impress them with the firm's majesty and omnipresence, and feel them out for potential purchases. The apprentice preacher, who'd attached himself to Zeke, like a surly, glowering lamprey, only underscored how badly this trip had already gone wrong. Now he was mentally revising his list with a hatchet, as the two of them strode down the lane to his rented lodgings. The overlap between men Uncle Rupert would be interested in seeing walk into his office looking to make a purchase, and men who would attend evening services at a traveling revival tent with a mass of filthy laborers was virtually non-existent. His uncle would be furious. Then again, Uncle Rupert seemed to spend his life in an alternating, and occasionally simultaneous, states of apoplectic fury and withering sarcasm, which impressed his wealthy clients and drove his staff to heights of terrified genius. This whole madcap enterprise, from start to finish, was nothing more than Carter overreaching his responsibilities within the firm. Zeke knew it. His harried cousin, Justice, knew it, and furthermore knew better than to write it down. It was impossible to imagine Darke not knowing it. Half the reason his uncle was driving them so hard on this was that he had to present a fait accompli or risk reprisals from the other partners. Zeke reflected with growing ebullience that as long as he followed the spirit as well as the letter of his instructions, none of the resulting debacle would be his fault. If worse came of it, why, it would have come no matter what he did. He had been put in an impossible situation. The only response to an impossible situation was to improvise. He turned to his traveling companion. "After we've inspected the gear, would you mind delaying our departure for a few hours? I have some business associates in town whom I absolutely must call upon today." Fuller cocked his head, apparently taken aback. Perhaps he had expected a different question. "And I'm supposed to wait with your assistance until you arrive?" "If you prefer, but I was very much hoping you'd be willing to accompany me. Advertise both our wares in concert, as it were." The young preacher looked adorable when he was at a loss for words. Zeke almost swooned. But no, this was a religious fellow. Best not to ask. Not right away, at least. He wondered if he had a sister. "I'm game," Fuller replied, smile tugging at the side of his mouth. "Let us go forth to..." "That was a disaster," Herman snarled. The horse flattened its ears and danced sideways under a low-hanging branch. He held back on the reins and gave it a sharp, open-palm slap on the top of its head. "No one asked you!" The horse blew out a breath between its lips and huffily cantered back to pace, its usual harness mate, which Hezekiah was riding. Zeke hadn't stopped laughing since they loosed the horses from the picket line and left the pandemonium behind them. "It was magnificent," he said, dabbing tears of mirth with an only partially bloodied silk handkerchief. "Absolutely magnificent. I wish my cousin could have seen it." "Get the horses! I can't lose sight of them! Get the horses!" He turned away and felt himself seized by the back of the neck. Herman's face was inches from his own. Zeke, normally a sanguine soul, shrank back from the light in the preacher's eyes. "We'll find him. I can smell his fear. And yours." Herman's arm shot out to grab Zeke by the front of his jacket, dragging him halfway off his horse by main strength. When he spoke, it was almost a whisper. "You planned this." For half a dozen heartbeats, Zeke fought for breath, unable to speak. Herman relaxed his grip, gasping and incredibly still smiling. The salesman sputtered. "I didn't know that was going to happen. We'd used that supplier before. Unreliable." The horses, who slowed to a walk, began to shift under them, sensing an opportunity to be rid of the unaccustomed weight. Herman shoved Zeke back into a rough balance. The other man grasped at his mount's mane clumsily, trying not to let the blanket slip out from under him. He'd ridden bareback before, but part of him hoped that trousers at least weren't a total loss. They rode through the moonlit woods in silence for a minute or two. Herman's shoulders slumped as he got his arms behind his rage and wrestled it back down. What was that thing supposed to do? Despite Herman's best efforts, the revival tent was coming down. His former congregation had left out brawling to stumble outside. The kerosene lanterns hung throughout the interior had begun to set the drooping canvas alight. He struggled with the flap at the back entrance, only for a scrawny figure who'd stood in the back of the crowd to shove past him. The wreckage of Hezekiah's damned device cradled in their arm like a child. The thief pelted off into the woods to the south as if the hounds of hell were after them. Zeke fought his way to Herman's side, his hat gone, his eyes wild. "Where is he?" he shouted over then. "Which way did he go?" Make the words of the person speaking into the microphone sound like the veriest truth to everyone who heard them, and to lower the natural inhibitions of the audience. Herman chewed on that for a while. I can think of a dozen things I'd do with a piece like that, but it didn't work. Manifestly not. What did your uncle want it for? Herman reined his horse to a stop. It was a potent threat. Zeke knew next to nothing of woodcraft, and would never be able to pursue the thief alone. He'd be lucky to find his way back to the highway before morning. The salesman weighed the consequences of revealing his uncle's plan against the consequences of not being able to return with the device, even if it was broken. We ran an auction house. Zeke stood composed, hands clasped behind his back before his uncle. Rupert smiled in self-satisfaction and exhaled, wreathing his nephew in cigar smoke. As he spoke, his eyes kept straying to the line of lace that fringed his companion's corset. Make them gullible, and then make them stupid. It's perfect. But I'm sending you personally, Hezekiah, because this is no matter for common gossip. Once they've seen it in action, the other partners will see I was right about this. But you've got to keep it quiet till then. He gave a sharp nod as if he considered the matter settled. Our goods are real, all right, but with this, the marks would buy dog shit and lie to their friends about it afterwards just to save face. The old man's laughter echoed off the gilt-trimmed walls. Ah, that brought a low chuckle. Hadn't thought of that one, but I see it. And you didn't hear that from me. Or at all. The preacher glanced back over his shoulder. From the looks of it, something back in the meadow was still on fire. He raised his eyebrows pointedly. Just because it doesn't work doesn't mean I'd be any less dead for not keeping my mouth shut. Merciful man, your uncle. Zeke was a hair away from launching into one of his usual speeches about the power of the firm when he realized this statement had been bitterly sincere. Mitterling waved urgently at Hezekiah's assistant as they elbowed their way through the throng and out of the tent. No, 9, my friend. Back this way. My wagon will be in the path of the evacuation. I must disarm it. The assistant stumbled over his feet for a moment, turning to follow the engineer. His expression was wary. Do you mean it's booby-trapped? It might explode? Ha, youth. He shook his head. No, I take great care to prevent theft, but do not condone the needless loss of life. The defenses are merely... The two men sprang aside as Brother Winter darted past them. He fled up the narrow dirt road, past Mitterling's wagon, and his proliferation of tools, satchels, and gadgets. His speed was impressive for a man well past his middle years. A gaggle of angry men followed in hot pursuit. One of them waved an improvised club in the direction of the wagon and shouted, There! Look there! Get a rope! His accomplices rushed to obey. Mitterling had been about to speak, but hearing this, stopped in his tracks and folded his arms against his chest. The assistant hung back, stealing a nervous glance over his shoulder. The tent was beginning to tilt at a rakish angle, and the sounds of fighting had not diminished. When the first man laid a hand on the wagon, a sharp clank sounded from its depths. 4 enormous nets launched out from each of the wagon's sides. Unable to halt their momentum in time, the shouting men went down in a tangle of waving limbs and loud curses. He could almost feel the ideas in his head coming together. A man who could smell fear, a preacher who cast off his religion like a cloak, a man who greeted the chaos of a bloody riot like a farmer settling down at a familiar hearth after a long day in the fields. That, he gestured at the long, raised ribbon of flesh down the center of Herman's chest, visible where his shirt had been torn open in the melee. That is not a scar. Says who? I've seen fleshcraft before. Herman looked him up and down, the muscles of his jaw working. He turned and spat into the underbrush. And you still have your original shape. He was a buyer. The sound of hoofbeats was loud in the darkness. Before the war, my family grew tobacco, mostly. Father used to motivate his workers by selling the least productive ones to him, or their children if we were short on men. Father had reason to suspect what was coming. He felt it was time to divest, and this man always paid in cash. How many people did you have? People? Hezekiah shifted uncomfortably. He supposed to a Sarkite anyone not of their own number was viewed with the same disdain he felt for the slaves his father had sold that day. He briefly regretted opening the topic, but the urge to satisfy his curiosity was too strong. 22 by then, mostly field workers, a few in the house, a few children. What did he show you? The senior preacher was already outside, pursued by a handful of red-faced men, one wielding the back of a broken chair like a club. Herman wove through the embattled crowd with the grace of a dancer at a high society ball. A punch to this one's face, kicked that one's feet out from under her, tossed another bodily out the front entrance. His expression was one of childlike delight, shot through with a sort of hunger that put a lump of ice in the salesman's belly, despite the stifling heat. Peering up from where he'd crouched protectively over the loudspeaker to shield it with his body, it took several minutes to realize what Herman was doing, keeping the scum from knocking the tent poles over. Entranced, he had no warning at all when a portly gentleman tumbled backwards out of the crowd, arms windmilling in a futile attempt to regain his balance. He crashed down on top of Zeke, who found himself pinned beneath the stranger and the now ruined equipment. He bound their hands together. Their hands themselves, you understand. The flesh stuck like it had grown that way. Herman was smiling now, one corner of his mouth showing teeth. Zeke pressed on. He said he brought out an ordinary length of rope and barely knotted it around each one's wrist. He said that if they wanted to keep their eyes, they wouldn't struggle. None of them did. Tall, thin fellow, pencil mustache, and the world's worst cravat. Zeke shook his head in disbelief. You know him? There aren't all that many of us. Of them, he added thoughtfully. Volkus. Josef Volkus. He practically lived on Mother's doorstep when I was a boy. Said she was the only American born he considered a proper black blood, like he'd be doing her a favor by taking her dead husband's place. He made a brief rasp that might have been laughter. Heard he died in a fire. I had wondered. Brother Winter loomed over the two boys. His normally snowy visage flushed with wrath. He raised his fist again, and they cowered, clinging to each other. "You defile the house of the Lord," he bellowed. "Sodomites! Blasphemers! I will not abide such wickedness. That freak struck a white boy." A woman's voice, thin and piercing, rose above the clamor of worshippers squabbling over bread. Pale as he was, Winter had been born to black folk, and he had overstepped the rules of this woman's universe. That was all she knew or cared to know. Her bonnet had come loose, leaving wisps of blonde hair to straggle across her face. "You all saw! How dare he! How dare he!" The heads of several men turned at this, their eyes seeking out Winter like hounds who'd caught the scent of prey. The boys, pale, Hand, and Darke, clasped together, scrambled out into the night. "Get him!" the woman commanded. Winter broke and ran. Herman shrugged. "A lot of them died in fires. Was hoping you'd know more." Zeke shook his head. He hesitated. An opportunity like this wasn't likely to come twice. "Can I ask something?" "Shoot. I saw a lynching once, as a boy." "Once?" Zeke grimaced. "Mother considered them coarse and forbade me to go. I had no desire whatsoever to see such a thing again, so I obeyed her." This inspired a contemptuous snort. "Some years later, when I learned that people like your family exist, and what their practices are, I was reminded of it. I'd always been curious if there was a connection." Herman rolled his eyes and rubbed a hand over his face. "That's your question? That's your fucking..." He paused, waving a hand in the direction they had come. "Look, all those people in the tent back there, if you'd stopped them on the street and asked, how many do you think would tell you that Jesus Christ was the only person who was ever crucified?" Completely baffled, Zeke started to say, "There were 3. Herman waved this away. "All right, you know what I mean. But everyone wants to pretend it's something special, something outrageous and different from the things you do every day. Crucifixion, right? Death by torture? Standard punishment for thieves or anyone who defied the Roman Empire." He shot Zeke a look to make sure he was following this. "When they had a slave rebellion, they would line the highways with crucified rebels. Imagine what that looked like. Imagine what that smelled like." "So it's been done before?" The salesman remained unenlightened. "Don't get me wrong. The Americans definitely innovated. Take some superficial regional variations in skin and facial features and tie everyone's belief in the power structure to that. Stroke of genius. But holding it all in place with public torture? That's not new. Hell, it never went away. The English, your ancestors, right? They were great at it. Drawing and quartering, the pillory, where the fun came from passerbys who knew nobody cared what they did to a convicted criminal, burning at the stake." He was beginning to warm to his topic. "The Norse had this thing they called the Blood Eagle, where... What is your point?" Zeke snapped. He'd already listened to one sermon that evening. "That's not Nalka. That's civilization. Humanity is a breed of brutal, inventive predators." His tone was admiring. "Civilization gathers up that hate, that tremendous destructive potential, and points it all in the same direction. Harnesses it for the use of whoever's in charge. And it works, as long as there's a clear line of dominance from the greatest to the least. Top man gets the cash, low man gets the lash." Writing in silence, Zeke tried to think of an objection. To him, civilization conjured up images of clean, brightly lit avenues, noble explorers, comfort and security. Yet he had seen with his own eyes the cost of that security, paid in toil and blood by those who had none. He pictured his Uncle Ruprecht, could only imagine the old man nodding along in agreement. Now, Mother might say, if she let you speak on it, maybe there's a connection in a philosophical sense. Animals naturally form into a pecking order. Human animals, after enough centuries of grubbing in the dirt, came up with a rough, clumsy approximation of things we know how to do right. When a carcist makes a sacrifice... Herman's voice trailed off. Zeke could have sworn he looked bereft, like a sinner who'd been cast out of paradise. When a carcist makes a sacrifice, she gets something out of it. For any lesser purpose, there are more ways to inspire terror, to crush someone under your heel, than there are bones in the human body, but none of them involve wasting perfectly good flesh by allowing it to die. He grimaced. Ma hates wastefulness. 1,000 reactions cascaded through the salesman's mind, chief among them an urgent need to immediately hire this man. Cost was not a consideration in the face of such rarity, which made his designs a perfect fit for the brand. As they spoke, the noise behind them had grown rather than abated. Herman was shouting for calm without success. "In what way are the aethers disturbed here?" "Quite ingenious, now that I see it," Mitterling replied. "The fog collects on every person's head and enfolds the breath with which each word is spoken, imbuing it with some force. In appearance, it is as though they stand in deep cold, breath turning to mist as they speak. The more they speak, the more it condenses. A cumulative effect. Every person?" He stared around the tent in dawning horror. Rather than the only voice of the preacher, every individual's words rang with power, and many of them had spoken aloud. Now, as if drunk on too much wine, they felt their own desires more keenly, and heard one another's words cut deep with the weight of perceived truth. Several scattered figures burst into hysterical tears. The boys huddled by the back entrance, threw their arms around one another's necks, and began to kiss. A harried-looking woman with 2 young children in tow took a swing at a man in tattered clothes who was stuffing bread into his mouth as fast as he could. A burly fellow snarled at someone next to him, and picking up one of the flimsy chairs, smashed it over the other man's head. Zeke turned to assistant and Mitterling and shouted, "Run!" The thief by now had ran a considerable distance on foot, carrying an unfamiliar burden. Why they continued to flee deeper into the tangled forest, and how they maintained a speed that continued to outpace 2 horses, moving at a modest trot, was a matter of some puzzlement to the 2 men. Zeke remained confident that whoever the probable co-conspirators turned out to be, they could be negotiated with. He had nonetheless cracked and inspected his hidden pistol for the sake of prudence. As their horses plodded up a shallow hill, they spotted the person they had been pursuing. At first, they seemed to have simply collapsed on the ground, and Zeke began to knee his horse forward. Herman held up a hand. "Look out," he hissed. "What's he got there?" Moonlight flashed off something silver as the hand of the thief swept down. A high, clear tone echoed across the meadow. "A tuning fork," Zeke whispered back. "What the devil?" Thus far, the device seemed to have the desired effect. The crowd had heard the sales pitch for the loudspeaker with appreciative oohs and ahs, and had now settled back to listen to the junior preacher with every evidence of rapt attention. His sermon focused on God's infinite generosity, which bestowed spiritual and material gifts to the faithful according to their needs. Herman delivered these humdrums point of doctrine with great enthusiasm, as if they were punchlines. Zeke's only half listened. His main focus was inward, trying to discern the device's effects on himself. A tap on his shoulder broke Zeke's concentration. He looked around with a start. "Her middling. Exceedingly good of you to come." The engineer's brief handshake was hard. It felt as though he wore an iron gauntlet under his riding gloves. His steel-framed lorgnettes might almost have been fashionable. However, in defiance of both fashion and good sense, the lenses were tinted a smoky gray, casting his eyes in shadow, and were held in place by a delicate chain that stretched up beneath his hat. "I am a busy man, as I told you, Mr. Carter. But in the end, the possibilities intrigued me, and I could not stay away." His smile was warm, his voice thoughtful, as he turned to survey the meeting. "The sound quality is not bad, but I wonder." Herman had begun reading a passage from the New Testament where the formerly doubting disciples distributed miraculously multiplied bread and fish to a crowd of 5,000. He raised a hand to two young men in their mid-teens, one black and one white, who had been standing alert near the back entrance. At the signal, each boy tugged on a cord that ran up into the shadows. What had appeared to be the roof of the canvas tent folded back, a series of false panels retracting to show the congregation with fresh-baked rolls. The revival tent grew momentarily too loud for discreet conversations. Gesturing for the engineer to follow, Zeke began to pick his way around the edges of the crowd to the low table where the loudspeaker had been set up, tended by one of the salesman's assistants. Mitterling leaned in close to Zeke and continued as quietly as he could into the salesman's ear. "I see what you mean about the unfeasibility of the design. In an enclosed space, such a great volume of fog in the air would make most commercial applications impossible." "Fog?" Zeke inquired, looking around the interior of the tent. Illumination from the kerosene lanterns hung from each tent pole did leave something to be desired, but the air was perfectly clear. The apprentice preacher was having some difficulty focusing the congregation's attention back on himself. Each seemed to be trying to collect the greatest quantity of the free food for themselves. In competition with their neighbors, the boys near the entrance giggled and whispered excitedly to one another, standing so close together their shoulders touched. "Ah, that explains the effect, my friend," Mitterling exclaimed. Look, come. I cannot show you what I see, but to you, a man of understanding, I will show you how I see it." The engineer turned to face the canvas wall, drawing an arm around the salesman's shoulders. Their backs to the room at large, he touched a small control on the side of his eyeglasses, which split apart at the center. Where Mitterling's eyes should have been were twin fires, red as the setting sun. Zeke's lips parted in astonishment, though he managed not to pull away. The heat of the forge spilled out through the enclosed steel clasp. As quickly as the lorgnette had opened, the engineer reached up to snap it closed again, his face alive with merriment. "I conceived of a way to see into the aethers, though I do not possess an alchemical aptitude. Needless to say, this design is not standard." Low tremors shook the ground. The horses bucked and shied and had to be calmed, or they would bolt. When the preacher and the salesman looked up again, a crack as long as a wagon had opened in the grass in front of the kneeling thief. With the steady basso rumble of distant clanks, it crept wider and wider. When the door had opened completely, the sounds increased rather than diminishing. Rising up from its circular maw, they saw a feminine figure, great black wings sweeping up from their back. Their arms gleamed silver to the shoulders, and a cascade of tight braids spilled down to frame the darkness of their face. The air seemed to blur and shift around them at first, obscuring them from view, then abruptly cleared. "Lottie!" cried a musical alto voice. The figure strode forward to crouch by the thief. A gleaming hand stretched out to clasp her by the shoulder and give it a gentle shake. "Where have you been? Are you hurt? How many times have I told you to bring your transmitter and leave word with the duty guard?" "7," Lottie replied, hanging her head with shame. She gestured to the pile of broken equipment. "Inventor, I have brought you spies!" A deep voice sounded from the woods behind them. The air blurred as it had around the inventor, then solidified abruptly into 4 more people, hovering around the 2 men on wings of iron. The horses reared in panic, throwing Zeke and Herman to the ground, and galloped off into the forest. The one who had spoken lifted a wing-tip to let them pass. As soon as the animals were clear, a chorus of heavy chains, each one tipped with an iron spike, shot out from the guard's wings to form a circle in the grass around the 2 men. Although it was dark and the guards were hovering, the angles were mathematically precise. Zeke was briefly grateful that he had no opportunity to draw his gun. Bleary-eyed, Zeke peered up through a forest of ironclad legs to see the would-be thief, her expression racked with guilt, scrambling up the side of the hill behind the inventor. The inventor nodded to the guards, murmuring a word of thanks. The circle of wings expanded, a half-dozen chains reeling back to make an opening. "I am Inventor Militant Antonia De Luca," the inventor said, gazing down at her captives with evident exasperation. She clasped Lottie's shoulder by her wince, less gently this time, with one hand, and with the other pointed a steel forefinger directly at Herman's chest. "And you two, and my foolish acolyte here, will explain very quickly how you came to bring flesh to the door of my workshop." "You two, and my foolish acolyte here, will explain very quickly how you came to bring flesh to the door of my workshop." Inventor Militant Antonia De Luca's voice was stern, but now that he saw she wasn't going to strike him down immediately, Herman mentally revised his chances of survival sharply upward. "You've got to help me," he wailed. "I can't go back." Lottie stared up at her commander. "You used the F word," she whispered. "I've never heard you say the F word." The hovering guards snickered at this. One raised a hand to their face, trying and failing to disguise snorts of laughter as a cough. The heavy chains extending from their wings to form a circular cage around Herman and Zeke rattled musically. "Wait until you get your wings, kid," quipped a booming voice. "You've never been on a raid with us." "Not now, Philippe." "Apologies, inventor," the burly guard replied. His lips twitched with suppressed mirth, but his iron wings never wavered. Antonia tilted her head at the young acolyte and blinked expectantly. "That man," Lottie pointed at Zeke, "brought a heretic device to that man's church tent." Her hand moved to indicate Herman. Both men did their best to look helpless and innocent. Sprawled in the grass where the horses had thrown them, they gazed up at the 6 nearly identical expressions of suspicion in varying shades of brown. Herman took advantage of the momentary silence. "My livelihood was destroyed. What will I do now?" "The device belongs to my uncle," Zeke added, nodding at Lottie. "She stole from me. And more importantly," Zeke thought to himself, "from his uncle's firm." "It belongs with us, doesn't it?" Lottie said hesitantly. to bring into harmony with God's design. That's the operating rule. Antonia sighed. When we have an active mission, it is. But these... Did you even know this one was marked by the enemy? The acolyte shook her head. Lottie, what am I going to do with you? We've been idle too long, said Antonia, before turning back to her captives. Tell me your names. Herman P. Fuller, at your mercy, ma'am. Hezekiah August Carter, Senior Client Services Representative, Marshall Carter and Darke. He trudged up a wan smile. I would give you my card, but I don't wish to give Philip the wrong impression. The inventor stood in thought for a long moment, raising a metal hand to stroke her chin. She turned to the acolyte. Lottie, run downstairs and fetch me Darius, and a jar. Philip, Flange, and Denise, at ease. Doris, search them. Yes, ma'am. Lottie grinned and dashed into the moonlit meadow. At the massive circular door in the ground, she leapt straight down, landing somewhere inside with a clang. A flurry of rattles and whickering thunks sounded as the guards rearranged the chains stuck into the grass around the prisoners. One, evidently Doris, shook her wings and folded them back, every chain but one retracting into the iron folds. She hunkered down on one knee next to Zeke, resting a fist in the grass. A single spike wove gently through the air, inches from his face. Now, I am an easy-going gal, Doris informed him. You just lay quiet. Hezekiah, right? And don't make any sudden moves. We'll get through this in no time at all. The first thing the inventor looked over was Herman's letter from his mother. It had not even been opened, which lent force to his overly dramatic protestations of woe and innocence. As it turned out, Madame Fuller had tactfully avoided asking the reason for his long absence from his kin, and had desired him to return home at once. Having learned the home address of a group of Sarkites, the Mekhanists intended to mount a military strike against them immediately. Herman practically demanded to help. His eagerness to assassinate his own family appeared, to Zeke's surprise, to be entirely genuine. He was allowed to sit up and awaited events with an abstracted look. The jar, when Lottie arrived with it, was a wheel-thrown pot of oak clay, unglazed. It seemed common, almost crude, until she lifted the lid. The same red sunset glow Zeke had last seen in Mitterling's eyes poured out. Even at this distance, the chilly autumn air grew a little warmer. Alchemical fire, attuned to the ideal temperature for atomizing flesh. You see? The inventor smiled down at Lottie. Sometimes the word is precise and not just vulgar. Understood. Keep that by. We'll need it to dispose of the alteration. Once I've removed it. Yes, ma'am. Despite the intense heat generated by the jar, Lottie seemed content to hold it in her bare hands. Darius proved to be a short, stout, wingless man, introduced further as a scribe, faithful to chalk. His hands and the left side of his head were sheathed in smoothly joined sections of steel plate. An arc light shone from his left temple, although admirably placed to assist the scribe in reviewing documents at the edge of a forest at night. Its beam stabbed into Zeke's eyes each time the other man looked up. After a cursory review of their other possessions, he and Antonia spent some time inspecting the blueprints
for the loudspeaker. They peppered Zeke with questions which drew heavily from the arcane dialect of engineers, in which Zeke was, regrettably, not fluent. What was the primary use case of the device? This, from Darius, was the first question that actually made sense. More or less the use to which it was put, Zeke said carefully, to enhance the inclination of customers to look upon a potential purchase with favor. That, he thought, was as far as he could go without placing himself in more peril. If they were willing to return the thing, if they were willing to repair and then return it, he might rescue this trip from disaster. Antonia tapped the folio. This shows some skill with alchemy, although the author's grasp of structural design is poor. Our previous source of alchemist fire has recently relocated elsewhere. My operating orders empower me to acquire resources as best I see fit. She pursed her lips, tilting a shining hand from side to side. The parameters can be somewhat flexible. If he hadn't been sore, damp, flat on his back, and surrounded by Mechanist soldiers with very good aim, Zeke would have leapt for joy. He wasn't going to die that night. He was going to make a sale. In the course of a brief but thorough haggling session, Zeke was surprised to learn that Mitterling's case was known to the inventor. The fabricator, or cleric foreman, of Mitterling's home factory was a high stickler, banishing a member of his congregation at the local level for unauthorized self-modification was well within the fabricator's scope. However, a formal declaration of heresy took time, and the legates have not yet ruled. A plea for clemency, or even better, a retroactive approval by the inventor, could potentially halt it before it ever reached a legate's desk, and would thereby gain the old man's considerable alchemical knowledge for Antonia's benefit. Furthermore, Mitterling would have the inventor's blessing to take on occasional projects for the benefit of Hezekiah's employers, at the engineer's own discretion. The salesman and the inventor shook hands on the deal. She hauled him to his feet as they did so. Darius, who had appeared to be meditating during the negotiations, raised his head and announced that a transcribed copy would be brought from the workshop momentarily for their signatures. He had not exaggerated. An iron raven, bearing a scroll in its talons, labored up through the gate and sailed across the meadow. Zeke gripped the stylus the scribe pressed into his hands and looked down at the scroll. You spell your first name with a 3? Antonia scratched the back of her head and waved this away. Long story. He nodded appreciatively and signed. Now for this, Antonia said, and turned to Herman. The anticipation in her face was both familiar and utterly alien to him. It was not, he judged, that she was going to enjoy doing it. Rather, she looked forward with immense satisfaction to the thought it would soon be done. She raised her right hand, which spread, retracted a layer of armor, and spread again, articulated joints appearing as scores of fine wires unraveled from their cores. My apologies. This is going to hurt. Herman was screaming. It made him feel like a kid again. He hadn't screamed in years. His family hadn't let him. He knew he'd had worse, but damn if he wasn't out of practice. Maybe this would be the last time. He reached for the kernel of silence in the darkness of his mind, and found something else there in it with him, a sound. Bright wheels that ring along rails with a chime. The breath of engines deepens, quickens, and swells. Brass wind bisected on the lips of bells. the sway and thrum of towers too vast to climb. One note, high and low and past the edge of hearing, its keen, unbearable, full of awe, a stillness of its own, vaster than his. It slid across his loneliness like a blade. He hated it. He hated it. It had to stop. It was everywhere. He screamed again, but for a very different reason. The trip had not been uneventful, but it had at least been swift. Sitting in the front parlor of the house where he'd grown up, Herman felt like a stranger. The wires Antonia left behind, she said, would stop the alteration his brother had carved in his flesh from growing back, in case she missed any pieces. She'd given him a pocket watch. When an opportune moment to strike arose, he was to set its hands to a number, then smash it. It would send a signal in a single pulse to Darius, who would relay the number of troops that Herman expected would be sufficient to deal with the threat. They could arrive in as little as 6 hours. He didn't think for an instant that these were the Mekhanists' only preparations. He just hoped they would bother to come at all. "How have you been, Mother?" Carefully, he handed her steaming tea in a delicate china cup. "Well enough, my son." Madame Fuller took a sip, then set the cup down with a clink. "I've got cancer again. Congratulations. A blessed day." Madame Fuller gave a rare, thin smile. "I had not thought to need to summon you home, though I suppose it must be decadent to surround oneself only with the lesser, who may be commanded to one's whim." Though her voice was level, her narrowed eyes made this a question. Herman cleared his throat. The mechanite wires under his shirt made him feel horribly conspicuous. The pocket watch dangled from his waistcoat, heavy as lead. "It was certainly a learning experience, Mother." "And what did you learn?" "Logistics." The unthinking honesty of this reply startled them both into silence. Madame Fuller sipped tea, recovering her usual grace. "I have decided it is time to bring you more fully into our life, Herman, though there are many tasks for which, of course, you are not suited. You are my offspring nonetheless. No child of mine can languish on the periphery forever." The words struck him like a blow to his stomach. Most of his life, this was all he had ever wanted. The boy he'd been 2 years ago would have wept with joy to hear Madame Fuller say she had a use for him. Now, when he was committed to revenge, it was too little, too late. Whatever plan she had in mind, he would never be more than a minor player among their ferociously competitive kind. He pictured his own name on a sign, painted 3 feet high, like the ones the revival caravan had put up outside the larger towns. Crowds flocking to see him. She could never give him that, and she would never let him go. "I'm speechless, Mother," he said, a little breathless. "In all honesty, I had lost hope. Truly, this is a blessed day." "Eloquent as ever, my son." She patted the side of his face, a gleam of anticipation in her eye. "There is to be a gathering tonight, in town. Your arrival is timely. Tomorrow we depart for the ceremonial site. For now we aim to see and be seen. Dress accordingly." He thought of the state of his wardrobe and hoped he hadn't outgrown it all. Herman, Madame Fuller, and Aloysius rode to the center of town in the carriage. After a few snide remarks about his brother's attempts to cobble together a fashionable outfit, Aloysius lapsed into an uncharacteristic, brooding silence. Neither was inclined to disturb their mother's meditations. This left Herman to stare out the window at the waxing moon. George was driving. He and his wife Bertha, who had doubled as the cook and as Madame Fuller's maid, had been with the family since the time of the senior Mr. Fuller. Sarah and John had been hired separately, and later, as Madame Fuller judged it needful to have extra help to manage a household of unruly and precocious children. Black people were rare in this part of the country. As far as Herman could figure it, having these four in her sway was a deliberate snub by his mother against their distant, and increasingly few, southern kindred. "We have the power to keep what we have," he imagined her saying, "and the law of the state of Massachusetts is no obstacle to us." There was something more to that thought, something that nagged at him, but it slipped away as the carriage pulled up to the gates of the mansion. Squinting, Herman could make out a few protective Irma chalked up on the gateposts. These glyphs, derived from the ancient Attitite language, distracted the untrained so that they failed to notice the gate at all, or ignored it as impassable. Madame Fuller had evidently prepared George for this. The carriage proceeded through. Lucretia greeted them warmly at the door, looking radiant as she always did after an extended use of her talents. She turned to Madame Fuller with a shy smile as she led them down a tastefully sumptuous hall. "Mother, I hope you'll enjoy what we've done with the place. Katerina wanted a more classic style. She did need my help with some of the centerpieces, but as far as I'm concerned, we really captured the aesthetic. Even her father couldn't find anything worse to say than we took long enough." Their mother gave a small and a small fluid movement of her shoulders. "Mr. Jellic would find fault with a river of blood if the temperature was off by 1 degree, she said dryly. "Funny you should say so," Lucretia replied, now unabashedly grinning. Other Irma, this time done in reddish-brown calligraphy on vellum, hung on the wall above a modest set of doors. A pair of bland-faced Irish servants swept them open with a bow at the Fuller's approach. Behind the doors, a grand staircase spiraled down into a space larger than the Jellic mansion. Crossing the threshold, Herman felt something different about the space itself. As the clack of a falling rock sends echoes across the width of a lightless cavern, he could feel himself gauging the invisible weight of the room with some new sense that was neither hearing nor sight. It felt subtly unreal, as though it had been made. He had racked his brain for scraps of lore about how such things were done. The room was a circular dome. At the far end, another staircase, identical to the one they were descending, rose into the darkness. Thick gray fog circled to encompass the room instead of the walls. Above the center of the room, a half-sphere glowed soft white with an Attitite sigil Herman read as Triumph, etched in red across its face. Lucretia described points of interest as they came into view, her voice tight with excitement. Suspended from the ceiling with artful randomness, people splayed like beached starfish, their intestines garlanded from one to the next. These dripped steadily, softly, atomizing into fine red mist above the heads of the partygoers. What appeared from a distance to be plush, if somewhat lumpy furniture, resolved on closer inspection into more distorted human bodies. There were people everywhere, distended into long sofas, bent and flattened into occasional tables, or near skeletal groupings of high-backed chairs. Guests in their most expensive finery sat in small conversational groups or drifted languidly around the room. Hats and jackets, or flowing skirts, fading to red where the fabric was light enough to show the stain. A string quartet nestled near the edge played soothing music under a low awning, which shielded their instruments from the mist. In the center, 6 unlucky souls were contorted into a circular buffet, various delicacies heaped at intervals along its surface. 3 pairs of faces had been fused together at the hinge of the jaw, mouths stretched wide to form 3 enormous punch bowls, little red and yellow globes, the swollen abdomens of tiny creatures that looked insectile, browsed along the lips, towering up from the center of what that was a viscous monstrosity, puckered with tumorous growths. It had presumably also been human, and might have had the misfortune to be so again. Those who could carve partook. There were no implements of any kind here. On one hand, Herman admired his sister's ingenuity in making the line between the somebodies and the nobodies, even among the guests so starkly public. On the other hand, he seethed with resentment at the reminder of which side of that line he was on. Lucretia broke off from the narrative of how she and Katerina had divided up the work, voice dropping again to a whisper. "Oh, and I almost forgot. In each area we made 1 or 2 partially insensate. Seems a waste," Aloysius muttered. Madame Fuller silenced his sour grapes with a pointed look. "Except for their hearing," the young woman finished acidly, "so they won't be distracted. They're going to tell us everything that's said tonight, afterwards." "A word to the wise is sufficient," their mother said, smiling for the 2nd time that day. She took her daughter's hand and squeezed it gently. "Truly, this is very fine." Lucretia's face flushed, her own smile incandescent. "Thank you, Mother," she breathed and ducked her head as Madame Fuller swept into the crowd. "Thank you, Mother," Aloysius repeated in a sing-song voice. Lucretia turned on her heel and gestured around the room and the hidden listeners there. "Some of us know you can drive a mule farther if you used a carrot once in a while, instead of just a stick," she snapped. And then with a shrug, she let her eyes flick, once at their mother's retreating back. "It even works on me." Herman wasn't exactly bored. In a place this unthralling, he refused to admit to intimidating, even to himself. It was impossible to be bored as such. He found himself idly reviewing the family conversation at the foot of the steps. Lucretia had always been a prodigy, but at the rate she was coming along, it was time to start laying odds on Ma's probable lifespan. Then again, if his own plan succeeded, the question was moot. As the party wore on, he couldn't decide which was worse. The guests who eyed him like he was part of the furniture and wouldn't speak to him at all, or the ones who sidled up to make some superfluous comment, probing for a reaction. He tried the punch and found it startlingly sweet, but quickly retreated from the embarrassment of having to drink out of his own cupped hand in front of the other guests. The jewel-like insects had proven to be ants, and he made a mental note to ask his sister where she had gotten them. A server passed by, their extended hands molded into a tray and smeared with condiments, like a painter's palette, a tidy pile of glistening red cubes in the center, a splash of matching bloody cavities across their muscular chest left little room for doubt where the pile had come from. Decadence, sir? With a sigh of resignation, Herman took a cube and picked a smear at random. He cast a shrewd eye over the server's face, chewing glumly. Damn, that was spicy stuff. You one of my sister's listeners? Sir? The level of calculated blandness could not have come from a mind that was less than alert. He swallowed, grinned, and jostled the server's elbow. You're good. You tell her I said. I bet Maud's gonna taste great. Only a matter of time. A swirl of blood-dampened skirts behind him announced someone else's presence. He turned and was surprised to not recognize the other guest's face. Olga Koshalova, she said, smiling and extended a hand. Her accent was Russian. I hear you are new. Come to Adatum's wake. That answered, to some extent, the puzzle of where the other staircase led. The notion that this room might have a relationship to geography in general, as it did to the visible extent of Jilek's property, had previously occurred to him. He'd read, but never before seen proof, that Nalka were still practiced in secret across Russia. It had originated there, among tribal peoples on the icy tundra, but the aristocrats under the czars had evidently adopted a more modern style. He shook Olga's hand, returning the smile. Herman P. Fuller, at your service, ma'am. Not new, come as such, but newly participating. Ah, she glanced around, her expression openly skeptical. And what do you think of it, now that you are here? He took a risk, hoping for a laugh. If this is Adatum's wake, when is Adatum's funeral? Olga scoffed, her mouth pinching into a moue of disgust. She turned and stalked away without saying goodbye. The server wandered off. As Herman stood there, mentally kicking himself, Lucretia approached, towing a staggering Aloysius by the elbow. There you are. I've been looking all over for you. I'd be lucky to smell a bonfire in this crush. What happened to him? Is he drunk? Herman asked, ignoring the brother's slurred attempt to reply. At the level of fleshcraft at which his siblings operated, it shouldn't be possible for a person to get drunk unless they deliberately allowed it, which made this circumstance all the more fascinating. It was the ants, Lucretia said, glowering at Aloysius. He ate too many red ones. I told him we got them from a friend of Mother's from elsewhere. Even I needed time to get used to the difference. And he had 7. She waved her free hand in the air, fingers curling into a fist. What do they do? Elsewhere was apparently as distant from Russia as it was from Massachusetts. He filed this tidbit away for later study. The ruby ants enhance sensation, Lucretia recited, rolling her eyes. She'd apparently delivered this speech from a number of times that night. The citrine sharpened the memory and enhanced cognition. One will wish to appreciate a delicacy of this nature in moderation, she finished with a growl. Herman had to bite his lip and turn away to keep from roaring with laughter, and he thought he had embarrassed his sister in ways he'd soon deeply regret. Get him out of here, Herman. Take the courage. Katerina will send Mother and I and one of her fathers. Go! George allowed himself a single wary look at the Fuller's brothers as they approached, but helped Aloysius up into the carriage without comment. Herman briefly considered sitting outside, then decided he might need to point his brother's head out of the window sometime before they get home. He just hoped there wouldn't be any chunks of what might be identifiable the next morning as human body parts. "It's ironic," Aloysius mumbled, his customary vicious hot air less impressive in his dishevelment. "Tent preacher, tent. One fell swoop. Mother's a genius." "What are you talking about?" Dread lifted the small hairs at the back of his neck. "Can't be a proper order without a Kirak. Show 'em we mean business." Aloysius paused, stifling a monstrous belt. "You're the fucking history buff." His brother began to snore. The carriage seemed to spin around Herman, his mind coated in a layer of ice. In the ancient days, when the faith was ruled by superstition, a Karcist might make themselves into a Kirak, an enormous living temple grown from the body of a single person, nobly sacrificing their own humanity and individuality, or so it was written, to create a place of safety for their kin. But modern practitioners thought differently. Those with the greatest power ruled and turned the lesser to their service. That was the natural order. That was why Mother had needed a spare. He spent the rest of the ride home in silence, trying not to panic. "Ah, flesh!" Darius sprang back from the telecogitator, slapping a hand over his natural ear as a squeal of feedback erupted from the machine. He shook his head and sat down again, calling up status reports. Lottie's tousled head poked in through the door. "You okay?" "I'm fine. Our mole ripped out his wire." "Aren't you supposed to be sleeping?" "Can't sleep." She bounced on her heels, thunking heavily against the metal floor. "Gonna stay up till the wings get back. I want to hear all about it." "Our new alchemist didn't keep you busy enough?" "Too busy. We tripled grenade production," she boasted with a grin. Darius oohed appreciatively and patted the acolyte's shoulder. He turned around to tap out more commands as he spoke. "Good work. We're going to need them. Since you're so full of energy, would you do me a favor, Miss Lottie? Stop by the inventor's workshop and ask her to come listen to this last burst I just got. Say it just like that, this last burst. Then swing on down by the armory and inventory the razor wire." Lottie saluted. "Can do." Madame did not realize the servants were gone until morning, when she awoke with no dress laid out and no teapot steaming by her bedside. Her senses confirmed the house too quiet, the courtyard empty and still. She had taken the time to wash up and dress herself, and drink a glass of cold water from the carafe. Her footsteps clacked softly down the hall and stopped outside her son's bedrooms, which stood across from one another. With the lightest of touches, she slammed open both doors, her arms extended out into the rooms, unfolding new elbows like a paper fan. Two startled yelps sounded, and then suddenly went silent. Reeling them back in a wet crunch, she hurled Herman and Aloysius out of their respective doors to slam against opposite walls. The paintings hung there rattled, but did not fall. The brothers slid heavily down to the floor. Herman looked up in horrified recognition, Aloysius in horrified bewilderment. Their mother's serene expression did not change. Good morning, my sons. I see you have slept very deeply indeed, Aloysius sputtered, finding his voice again. Good morning, Mother. How might we be of service? Do you know, she replied with a tilt of her chin, I was just asking myself the same question. The body of her eldest began to twist and elongate, his mouth locked open in a rictus of silent agony, as his arms stretched out over his head to join with his feet. His whole body thickened into the shape of a wheel and shuddered upright. The wheel rolled down the hall, picking up speed as it went, and bounced off the ceiling on its way downstairs. She turned to her youngest. What did you do when you returned? Hauled Aloysius up the stairs myself, then sent George off to the servants' quarters, Herman said. All technically true. She would know if he lied by his pulse, by the tension in tiny muscles across his face. I didn't think you'd want to come home to a puddle in the foyer, and any mistakes he makes, I can't fix. Indeed, Madame said with a tiny frown. Herman melted into a fleshy tangle, knotted up like macrame, except for his head. She wanted him listening. The fingers of Madame's right hand extended, then extended again, long and white-knuckled and spider-like, to lift him off the floor. She strode down the hall at the same steady pace as before. I hold Aloysius more fully responsible, Madame said pleasantly. She lifted the twitching skein of her younger son above her head as she descended the staircase. He forgot himself and indulged to the point of incapacity, which does not excuse his lapse of duty. But he was not sensible when you returned. You were. Morning sun filtered into the parlor through sheer curtains, which had not been drawn. There were no signs of disarray. Every ornament was in place. Even the pillows on the sofa leaned at the same angle as the previous day. Not an attack from an enemy, then, nor some simple-minded rival hoping to pass this off as the work of common thieves. Madame stepped over the coil of Aloysius and went down the hall to the kitchen. Her nostrils widened as she stepped through the door. Much had happened here. Fear, desperation, rage, despair. Excitement? She sniffed again, then frowned and drew her hand back into itself, dropping Herman on the floor, his skull concussed where it struck. She repaired it. You bled in here last night. How? He gulped like a fish out of water, mind still unhinged from pain and the lack of familiar sensations, such as lungs filling with air. He managed to squeak, Midnight snack. Cut myself. Madame sighed. In her rush to punishment, she already changed him enough that this explanation could not be checked. More fool she. She turned and stalked back to the parlor, remolding Herman's body and willing it to slither along at her heels. Aloysius had managed to partially straighten himself. His features drooped and sloughed as he pulled them back into place. Mother, he gasped, choking down a whimper. May I know what I've done? Other than appear weak in public at a critical time? He shrank back at this, but she continued. You don't happen to have 4 otherwise useful servants tucked away in there, hmm? The young man shook his head, his half-melted face falling. No point in trying to repair it now, though he'd learned to unfold pockets of non-existent space within his own body just that summer. Aloysius couldn't have subsumed that much flesh yet, even if he'd wanted to. Besides, that would have been stealing from Mother. Losing something that belonged to Mother was almost as bad. With a wave of her hand, he fell back, twisting up again. Madame clasped her hands, tapping her thumbs together in thought. Her will grasped the two of them. Again and again she fused her flesh together in impossible contortions, then let it flow apart, like a nervous gambler shuffling a deck of cards. There was now, of course, a logistical problem as well as a tactical one. The Kirak ceremony could not be delayed. She had to be the one who raised it, from flesh she nurtured in her own womb. She had worked too long, called in too many favors, twisted too many arms and other appendages to bring this plan to fruition, to see it falter now. Good morning. Lucretia patted down in her nightdress, stifling a yawn. She blinked, mesmerized by her brother's roiling flesh. She could have watched it for hours. What have they done this time? They lost the entire staff, Madame murmured, still tapping her thumbs. She let the boys' bodies come to rest in two separate, quivering heaps. Their faces were recognizable, though they had no mouths, and neither one seems to know anything about it. Oh, drat, that's the second time this year. Lucretia hung her head, twisting a lock of auburn hair. They grew bold again so soon. You mustn't blame yourself, my dear, her mother reassured her. The Lessers have much of our cunning, and they may well have thought the delay would make them impossible to track. Lucretia tittered at this. Well, they won't try a ship this time. Madame shook her head. That is a discussion for another day. We must leave as soon as possible. I'll make us some tea, get dressed, and fetch the horses, Lucretia said, turning to head down the hall. Yes, Madame replied, eyes on her sons, hands suddenly still. The horses. When the Fuller's cart turned into the lane, Lucretia was driving. Though the pony held to a smart trot, the young woman lounged at her ease. Up ahead, her mother sat in the carriage box behind matched Arabian mares, which were bulkier than usual. Separating out a young man's bodily systems and redistributing them across the interior of a horse was an easy task for Madame, yet gratifyingly stressful for her erring sons. The horses' simple minds were held in deep repose, while the boys labored to pilot their unfamiliar forms at a demanding pace. It would do. She had been pressed for time. After 2 long days on the road, the head of the mare, which contained Aloysius, was drooping, her flanks slick with sweat. The parts of the horse's body, which came from him, had never pulled a carriage before, nor done much else in the way of hard labor, and were utterly exhausted. Herman's horse was in better shape, but still puffed and blew when Madame reined them to a stop. Curious heads turned here and there around the temporary camp. The 2 visible Fullers had remained aloof the previous night and swept in the carriage. Whispers of speculation had passed the length of the column, rumors swirling like autumn leaves. Now they would learn what their would-be leader had up her sleeve. The aristocratic colonists who brought Nalka from the old world had known great success in breeding for otherworldly talent, but until recently had been so widely scattered that little organization was possible. A number of individuals claimed the title of Karcist, with social and religious authority over their kin to match. Madame sought to unify them into a single group. Only a demonstration of unquestionable dominance would reconcile these local leaders to accept what amounted to a demotion. Most saw the benefit of taking on the role of her Volutar, her advisors, and when push came to shove, her enforcers. The mares tossed their heads and opened their mouths, letting loose a torrent of frothy red slime. A few low chuckles and approving murmurs sounded as the onlookers put two and two together. Horses cannot vomit naturally, and even Madame wouldn't have dared come without a child she intended to sacrifice. When the confused beasts finally spat out 2 bundles of stained and rumpled clothing, the young men's bodies had almost completely reformed. Someone off in the shadows began a slow clap. Nobody joined them. "We see how your eldest is repaid for his foolishness, Gabrielle," came the clipped voice of Mr. Jellic. He lifted his stein in Madame Fuller's direction. Madame pursed her lips, but did not reply. She disliked her given name, which Jellic knew, yet his misdirection allowed her to save face, and she needed his faction support. "I wasn't overcome that badly," Aloysius protested, still shaken from his ordeal. He had missed the byplay, and his pride was hurt. "The problem was that you were so sloshed I had to haul your ass upstairs in a bucket," interrupted Herman. "A platoon of Mekhanists could have run through the courtyard in a brass battle wagon for all you knew about it." Nervous laughter rippled around the campfire. Madame's incipient frown smoothed away. Inwardly, Herman swore at himself. Why was he defending her? 2 days stretched out across the inside of a horse had brought all his old reflexes back to the surface. "But they could have set their watches to your snores," Herman quipped. He caught his brother's eyes and glanced urgently up at their mother. Aloysius' mouth made a small O as his brain finally caught up. Madame had been angry at them in the first place for making her look weak. Losing servants, disposable as they were, would also make her look weak. Well, yes, how fortunate that my little half-brother was around to drive them off. Couldn't have been too difficult even for you," he managed a credible sneer. The tension in the air was broken. The laughter reached a crescendo. One corner of Madame's lips tugged upwards. Young ladies collapsed into hiccups. Young men slapped their knees and came up with their own variations on the joke. Even Mr. Jellic took refuge in his drink to hide a chuckle. As the brothers staggered off to find clean clothes and unhitch the horses, only Lucretia's gaze followed them. Her eyes narrowed in speculation. Driving the cart the next morning, Herman's stomach was in knots. Every so often he'd spot a raven perched in a distant treetop and find himself hoping it was made of iron. Every possible way his plan could go wrong played itself over in his mind. He glanced down with a start as something oozed its way up around the boards of his seat next to him. The undulating mass seemed familiar. Sure enough, it flipped inside out to reveal the folds of Lucretia's traveling gown. As her arms solidified, she gave the dress a sharp shake, and releasing a cloud of road dust. Herman snorted. "Show off." "I'm entitled," his sister preened, flipping her hair over her shoulders. She leaned forward, smiling into Herman's face as she clasped one of his wrists with both hands. Her fingers were conveniently near his pulse point. "I got your message." "Oh," he said, remembering the party. Seemed like a year ago. What he said to her spy? "Ma's going to taste great, only a matter of time." If he'd known their mother's plan, he would have kept his mouth shut. He shook his head. "Sis, you know I'll say any damn thing to flatter someone who's likely to serve me up with the hors d'oeuvres." A lone man on horseback trotted past, headed for the front of the column. The Irma painted on his saddlebags directed the attention of ordinary travelers away from the group. The patrollers also kept watch for less ordinary threats. "Hiding from clockwork nights, my lady?" called the outrider, tipping his hat. "Oh, yes," Lucretia exclaimed, pretending to faint. "Save me, kind sir." He laughed, nodded respect to the two of them, and rode on. Lucretia turned to Herman again. "Is something unexpected going to happen tonight?" Her touch on his wrist was feather-light. "Just a joke, sis," he said. His voice was level, but Lucretia's smile grew wide. "Your words say no," she whispered, "but your heart says yes." She waggled her fingers, her legs already reshaping to ooze back down towards the road. "Off to meditate. See you soon." Herman growled and wished he had something to break. A crescent moon hung like a scythe against the treetops. The first line of celebrants filed out in loose circles around the edge of the clearing. Their garments sported horns and fur and feathers. Solemn chants rose and fell, a few voices adding in animal sounds. Most numerous were the Zend, who, like Herman, had for the most part been born to the members of the group, and perhaps had a trace of power. The lowest rank of worshippers, the Orin, served the great families and were educated in their faith, yet weren't necessarily of them. Those who survived this night hoped to win a more elevated role for themselves or their offspring. One or two stumbled on the small round stones that littered the ground under the blanket of fallen leaves, but everyone kept to their pace and their places. For now they watched and waited. The sacrifices would come later, under the heart of the temple Madame was about to raise. The inner circle followed, transformed by their own will to demonstrate power and precedence. Aloysius' head was gone, his torso a jagged vertical mouth, whose fangs overlapped to jet past the eyes set in his shoulders. His forearms split into writhing tongues instead of hands. Lucretia skittered on tall, segmented legs, her body extruded into colorful folds like a sea slug, glistening with toxins. The Jellics towered behind them, twin columns of broad intestinal cylinders twisted like vines. One of the few surviving members of the southern delegation had an exaggerated feminine form. Innumerable infant arms extended from her skin to conceal the curves of her body instead of clothes. Her face was furred with arachnid mandibles. Another, from the west, had sculpted himself into a single smooth, blank surface. He held up one enormous eye with a muscular arm, as an endless procession of faces rose up through his skin, screamed silently, then sank back. All in all, there were nearly a score of local Circuses, drawn from around the continent to cement this alliance and prevent their rivals from getting the upper hand. Madame Fuller followed last. She was naked and still appeared human, but did not shiver in the icy wind. Her youngest child walked before her, fully clothed, eyes turned resolutely downward. For some reason, the only thought he could keep in his head was that he didn't dare look at the sky. As Herman reached the center of the clearing, the chants changed tempo, swelling into a harsh refrain. A stone rolled away from his foot as he suddenly halted, no longer in control of his legs. His mother's voice behind him rose in an Aditite doom song, more than 1,000 years old. Herman had read a copy of it himself, curled up in a corner of the library, fingers tracing out faded runes to sound out the harsh, ancient words. That and the familiar wet cracks of his mother expanding herself to do serious work seemed likely to be the last things he would ever hear. I called for any who would hear me, demanding to know the purpose behind such bloodshed, and the grand Carcist appeared before me, and revealed unto me a most abominable truth. The world is an altar, and each death is a sacrifice to the ravenous gods of suffering and pain. Someone in the outer circle tripped and cried out. Their screams blended in with the chanting in the corner of his eye. Herman saw flames ignite at the hem of their robes. He looked up. A flock of ravens swept across the moon. Simultaneous explosions thundered in a near perfect grid across the width of the clearing. Some celebrants were ripped apart by the blasts. Others staggered, howling with agony as their gaping wounds caught fire. A handful from the outer circle made a dash for the wagons parked along the trail. They came up with rifles, pistols, and whatever ammunition had been on hand. Some ran straight back up the trail, looking frantically around for an enemy no one could see. A few who tried to dart back through the underbrush stopped short, struggling, ensnared in the strands of razor wire strung from tree to tree. Meanwhile, the inner circle slogged off layers of flesh which had taken the worst damage. Most had reserves of living mass stored up from fallen foes or victims. The Carcys began to grow, carving themselves into weapons. Aloysius roared, rearing back on legs which bulged with muscle and poised to jump. The appendages at the ends of his arms lengthened, whip-like, now ending in a pair of hooked claws. Mr. and Mrs. Jellic leaned towards one another, twin trunks of coiled flesh, which rooted to the spot and shot up into an enormous tree. Its thorny coils lashed the air with glistening, venomous spikes. The small, soft arms clinging to the southern Carcist lengthened, fusing together. Her new fists gripped dagger-sharp splinters of bone. Her arachnid head expanded in all directions with chittering cracks. Lucretia folded most of her legs up around her body like an armored second rib cage. A set of white feathered wings shot out from between them. Two to the front sprouted into long, wicked pincers, wet with the same toxins that had coated her body. A layer of skin oozed out through the underside and slithered off to hide in the bushes. A lucky shot from a rifle chimed off of unseen iron wings. A soldier blurred into view, chains flying wild as they plummeted. The western Carcist ripped a face off his back and hurled it at the soldier, coating their wings and head in viscous, clinging red. More Mekhanists dropped concealment as they took damage or dove towards the field to engage. The iron chains of each four-person wing worked in concert with the soldiers' metal fists and feet to rip their enemies apart. Teammates swooped past to set the bloody chunks ablaze. Some of the larger Carcys fended off multiple units, who pelted them with projectiles or spread out to slice them apart with lengths of reinforced wire. The icy leaves that had shrouded the ground were quickly churned into a smoldering sudden melange of viscera and sheared off scraps of iron. Madame herself had pocketed enough flesh to build a cathedral. She swelled from the center of the group like a cancerous mountain. Needle-toothed, grinning gashes opened on her surface to spew lumps of her own burning flesh back into the sky. Wet, leathery wings separated from her back and shook themselves out as insectile claws extended from a rapidly condensing thorax. Eyes grew everywhere. Traveling mouths swarmed towards her new head with a chorus of rising howls, as cries of mindless anguish trapped inside Madame for years burst loose. She lunged up with a powerful downstroke that swept nearby combatants off their feet or out of the air, her cavernous maw snapping shut to swallow a nearby Mechanist whole. The inventor plunged from above in a vertical stoop, her stream of shouted curses drowned out by the din of battle. The steel plate, which normally covered her arms, jutted forward in the grip of skeletal metal hands, forming a two-handed sword which hummed a single high, clear note. Her blade caught the lower edge of Madame's teeth and sliced her from chin to stern, cauterizing as it cut. Its passage spilled a torrent of disordered guts and a single blood-drenched soldier. Nearby wings took advantage of the opening and focused a fiery barrage on the beast. The inventor rose back up and went for Madame's wings, cutting them to ribbons as she dodged return fire from the howling mouths. Soldiers swarmed the monster's flanks, ripping out chunks with bladed chains and hurling fire into the wounds. Soon, like a great ship sinking into the sea, Madame broke apart and thudded to the ground, piece by piece. A skeletal, bird-winged monstrosity, small only in comparison with Madame, had fought to defend her with more savagery than skill. It had wounded a number of assailants, aiming for narrow expanses of brown skin amid black iron. Those scored by its claws listed dangerously in the air, their flight paths going ragged as toxins gripped the parts of their bodies that were still flesh. But in the end, it too disintegrated, shattered by the spikes of multiple units who collapsed around it and all burst away at once. Aloysius had cornered Doris near the edge of the trees. She was out of grenades, and her natural left arm hung limp, pierced by a sliver of bone. He yanked her towards his gnashing vertical mouth in a series of irregular jerks. Overhanging branches shook loose a light dusting of snow as the Mechanist's wings labored to keep her aloft. Each time she burst one set of hooks apart with her chains, he'd lash out with the other. Aloysius was accustomed to working indoors, one-on-one, and thus neglected to watch his back. The rest of her wing barreled past on their way from exhausting their own ammunition on Madame. One planted a metal foot along Aloysius' spine, their chains reaching around to grapple his fangs, pulling him off balance with his mouth stretched open. The other two spiraled up past the edge of the treetops and came back resupplied, pelting him with missiles from top to toe. He fell back, writhing, and went down in flames. Turning to find no enemies left whole, the wing exchanged handclasps and celebratory shouts. Three rose to scour the nearby trees for wounded Mechanists or fleeing foes. Doris herself hung back, only pausing on her way to the medics to drag her burning assailant off to the pile at the center of the clearing. Others scattered across the battlefield were performing the same duty. Most of the flesh in the growing heap had once been madam. Occasionally, a smoldering lump would spasm, as if trying to pull itself together. Alert sentries answered this with fire. A column of smoke curled up past the moon's tilted smile. From the moment the bombs went off, no one paid attention to Herman. For the first and last time in his life, that suited him just fine. He escaped the initial grenade blast by sheer luck. It took some ingenuity to avoid being absorbed in the expanding bodies of his mother and her friends, but he was light enough on his feet to manage it. Past the initial ring of shrubbery, much of the forest bracken had been cleared out. The Mekhanists had had 2 days to prepare the site, and they were thorough. At a crash to his right and the sound of crackling flames, Herman ducked back behind a tree. He peered out slowly. The Jellics, sliced clean through across the midsection, had toppled into the forest, thorny pseudopods thrashing as they fell. Strands of nearby razor wire broke off with irregular spangs. Herman eased forward, ducked under a stubborn wire, and trudged out into the woods, trying to stare up and over his shoulder in every direction. As the clamor faded in the distance, he felt a kind of effervescence in his spirit. Hope and Herman Fuller had not previously been introduced. It was dizzying. Deep in the underbrush, close to the ground, the smoke was still so thick Lucretia didn't dare form anything like a nose. Carefully, she extruded 2 slender eye stalks, poking them up through the branches. It was enough to track the soldiers' movements. They descended at regular intervals to cut away burned flesh from the pile, letting the fire spread deeper inside of it. The Mekhanists clearly intended to leave nothing behind but ash. Even if she were the only survivor, this was an opportunity not to be missed. A shiver of anticipation rippled through her form. There in the clearing was a feast the likes of which she might not see again for centuries. Mother's death was a potent lesson on the dangers of being too visible. The head that wears the crown is the first to meet the guillotine. She stretched up her eye stalks for another look. A long, slow swivel revealed only a handful of winged creatures in the sky. They hovered, facing one another, their gestures revealing an agitated conversation. Perfect. Almost the first living flesh Lucretia encountered, oozing in under the base of the bonfire, was her elder brother's Akuloth, a tiny creature melded with the essence of his power. Finding the worm intact was better than having his entire living brain in her hands. She would have laughed till she cried if she had a face. Now all she had to do was tuck away everything she could that hadn't been burnt yet, put Aloysius back together, and convince the vain fool that he had rescued her. She wriggled deeper into the heap of gore. Herman was right. Mother was delicious. It was devastating, Mitterling lamented. He leaned over the bar, adding another pinch of bicarbonate to his soda water, and a liberal dash of bitters. The bartender had left the bottle. To learn this brilliant group had been disbanded, myself excommunicated, on the night of such a great victory? For the first time, I regret these eyes. I wish I could weep. From what Hezekiah had seen of the inventor militant's works, the Mechanite leaders were not merely fanatics, they were fools. But he hadn't ridden all the way to Concord to watch the engineer marinate in regrets he could not drown. It astounds me that such excellence would be swept aside over a point of doctrine. I came in answer to your letter myself, Herr Mitterling, to reassure you that Marshall, Carter, and Darke knows how to value excellence. Your work with us will not be tethered by rusty, outdated theologies. A commotion sounded in the street outside, rising above the steady patter of hail. The barkeep peered out of the window and quietly lowered a hand beneath the counter. Mitterling patted the salesman's arm. You were a fine lad, Mr. Carter. It will be good to work again. But to see alchemy itself forbidden, just when I had some hope of returning. He stared moodily into his drink and gave the counter a small thump with his fist. Fleisch! The last power source added to the Book of Errors was radioactive metal after the Davite Wars. How was that a precedent? The shouts outside grew in volume. Hezekiah's ears perked up at the sound of a familiar, angry voice. Of all the people he'd never expected to see again. As rapidly as he could, within the bounds of politeness, Hezekiah paid his tab and Mitterling's, handed the engineer the travel vouchers and letters of introduction he'd brought along, set his hat firmly on his head, and dashed out the door. The deputy sheriff let Hezekiah into the holding cells, then stomped off to root around in his desk drawers. The salesman had walked in, doffed his hat, and slapped a slightly oversized pile of currency on the desk, and demanded a receipt for the payment of Herman's bail. The deputy disliked being ordered around, though he did pocket the bribe. The cell's lone occupant looked up from his slouch, but made no move to rise. He looked well for a man who just narrowly lost a fist fight with a gaggle of policemen in a hailstorm. Zeke, your uncle's firm hiring horse thieves these days? The salesman laced an arm through the bars, propping his forehead against them. Alleged horse thieves. Ensuring an informant's charges are dropped is a trivial expense. And here I thought you cared. Herman's sarcasm was amused, not offended. Zeke blushed, not bothering to turn his face aside. He had almost forgotten the man could smell pheromones. You know, before I knew your background, I hesitated to ask, and failing that, I wondered if you had a sister. Not anymore. Herman's laugh was a handful of gravel. You're barking up the wrong flesh, Zeke. Not that I blame you. Many a heart's been broken on these rugged shores. An elegant wave indicated his own bedraggled face. Levering himself to his feet, Herman strolled over to lean companionably against the bars. He tapped a finger to his forehead. But I do have a proposition for you. Say on, cruel sir, my heart will mend, Zeke replied, placing a hand over his heart with a slight bow. Business is my one true mistress. At least a dozen Circuses from around the country recently died in a fire, Herman said, his smugness almost palpable. Very mysterious. Some of them, tragically, left no next of kin. A lamentable loss. Great houses standing empty, crops rotting in the fields. Books, Herman insisted. Old Sarkic books, sitting around for the taking. I've been to most of these homes. This is the stuff that'll melt your face if you don't know how to read it right. He shook his head with a smile, as if at a fond memory. My family's kind of magic isn't for me, and I don't have the resources for a cross-country trek, but there's got to be something I can work with. Something that'll give me an edge. Why, Mr. Fuller, I do believe we can do business. The insular Sarkites were hardly frequent customers, and their lore was sought after in certain circles. Zeke grinned. One of the advantages of being Rupert Carter's own nephew was that if he found something of interest to one of the other partners, he could risk taking it straight to the source. Tell me, have you heard of the Wanderer's Library? Green mist enveloped the two men, then swept back as the way furled itself shut. Bookshelves of every description stretched into the distance. Behind them, the ceiling climbed slowly up, braced by fluted columns of something gray that wasn't quite stone. Up ahead, the shelves gave way to a rough archway of the same material. It opened into a broad cavern. The dim light showed other identical archways scattered around its edges. Bundles of phosphorescent purple lichen dripped from the ceiling in delicate strands at irregular intervals. Each strand was enveloped by a cloud of spores, which danced in the eerie light but never fell. A figure in a floor-length traveling cloak stood behind one of them. Their posture was one of deep contemplation, hood thrown back, eyes closed, drawing slow, deep breaths. A cloud of spores swirled briskly around their head. Hezekiah cleared his throat. He had managed not to show his nervousness when explaining the situation to the senior partner's secretary, but interrupting the man himself at his studies was another matter. Mr. Darke? Darke exhaled, his eyes snapping open to focus immediately on the two of them. The spores fled upwards in a cloud towards the lichen strand. Who? Ah, you're Rupert's nephew. Hezekiah, wasn't it? He strode forward, brushing irritably at his nose. The Legislet are meticulous historians, which almost makes up for their unorthodox methods of record-keeping. Good of you to remember me, sir. Nonsense. That alchemist you sent me was competent, for a change. In fact, the salesman brightened a bit. It was through Mitterling, indirectly, that I became acquainted with Herman Fuller. Herman nodded. Pleased to meet you. Zeke continued. Mr. Fuller has knowledge of the location of several collections of Sarkic literature in good condition, some of which may have recently become ownerless. He also seeks guidance in a course of thaumaturgical study. I surmised you might take an interest, sir, and your granddaughter was kind enough to contact us here. Ownerless? The senior partner tilted his head at Herman. How did they die? Alchemical fire, said Herman, his smugness creeping back in. Stank to high heaven. Rare books and recent intelligence. Yes, Darke murmured. Abigail knows my tastes. My thanks, Hezekiah. That will be all. He waved a hand in a fluid motion. The salesman evaporated in another cloud of green mist. Herman had almost caught that gesture. The other man began to stroll down the aisle, his face thoughtful. Herman fell into step beside him. Before we get to recent news, I must think on what literature to recommend. Tell me, which languages do you read? English, Latin. Herman tilted a hand from side to side. Schoolboy, Aditite. A crack of laughter escaped Darke. He raised the back of his hand to his mouth, as if the sound had surprised him. Ha! Schoolboy Aditite. Ha! Young Fuller, I foresee you are going to be a pleasure to teach. The corner of Herman's mouth crept slowly up. That was the nicest thing anybody had said to him. He gazed around the library hungrily, wondering how long a man would have to live to read it all.
It isn't so uncommon, the wooden grinding of wheels against gravel, the pops as pebbles are crushed against one another and spat into the air, trot of hooves and the smell of horse dung the wagons carry with them. No, that doesn't catch my attention. They're merely integrated, sneaking in through the window at night, coming to rest on my pillow and whispering new dreams into my head. Dreams of a white-covered carriage and a handsome, humble craftsman, extending his hand to me to pull me in with him and take me somewhere fantastic. No, these ordinary sounds only lull me deeper. It is the hooting and hollering that wakes me up proper. My eyes crack open and I wonder if the pub down the street has left its doors ajar. But as I listen to the night, it only fills with more and more cheering. I sit up. Celebrations? At this time of night? I look out my window at the looming orange moon, shifting as if it were in an amorphous smoke of the house next door. Midnight, at least. An unholy hour to be awake for any girl my age. My heavy head urges me back to sleep, and I nearly follow it, curiosity dwindling, before my nose catches onto a peculiar aroma. One or two deep huffs of air, and all of my senses come back at full. Awake, alert, and excited. There is a moment's pause as I listen to the night, and my body regains its energy. The occasion calls for stealth. Mother wouldn't be so happy to finding me wasting my youth on nightly strolls again. I get out of my bed and imagine my feet as mouse paws. I slip on something more appropriate for an outing, but I rush and leave behind a fair deal of my usuals. Put on my dress, but forego plenty of the ribbons, and don my socks, but forget to pull them high. A hat seems ridiculous for a night as warm as this, and I let my hair down because a braid would take too long. Besides, I only have so many good clothes, and the streets are muddy. Another rise in the waves of whoops hastens my trip. I tiptoe past my mother's room on the second floor, and then run a pitter-patter down the stairs. In the pitch dark of the shop, I fumble for the keys on the counter and let myself out the front door. The night is warm and inviting. Summer reaches even here in the foothills, where rain pools between all the cracks and crevices, and the air is humid for a foreseeable eternity. The 1- and 2-story buildings come up everywhere. Terrain is flat enough, betwixt the verdant alders, beeches, and grass. When I was very little, there used to be a family for every house, but now half the smokestacks are empty. Most of the windows are never lit. Somewhere far, but not too far, the city has drawn the eyes of my neighbors. I lock the store behind me and breathe deep. Above the damp soil comes that smell. That smell I've only smelled so many times. So much stronger than I have ever imagined I could smell it. Sweet and delicious. Sugar. I hear more substance in the yells as I draw closer to the crowd huddled outside of the pub. They are shouting bets. 4 shillings! 8! The crowd oohs at the jump to tumbling, and some louder demanding voice rises above it. Man of action! Any more? As I approach, I glimpse a basket passing between the hands of the men and their consorts. A crowd of drunkards and the occasional whore are all gleefully tossing coins at the taller men prancing around with the basket. His extended gait gives me pause, the way he stumbles about and nearly falls over. It looks like he must be walking on short stilts. His face comes with a modest patch of beard just below his lip and a bright, bristly mustache. He is clean and groomed enough to be taken for a higher class, if not for the poorly concealed patch seams, sometimes caught by the fire's light. When I look at him, the senses clarify. The smell, the sweet, is his. Oh ho, I think we're done, he bellows. I sneak up just to the glow's edge so that my small stature might be lost in the darkness and the rowdiness won't suck me in. I find a log among the gravel and sit on it. The stilt man wobbles back to the center of the crowd, standing just behind the fire, which throws long shadows from his legs across his chest and face. His mere stature and presence hushes the crowd into a captivated pause, deeper and louder than before. I bring you a relic from a distant land, where the sands twist and howl through the wind, and the sun crests so close to the earth you can feel its burn from a raise of the hand. To the south and to the east, the wide deserts from horizon to horizon, from sea to sea. The clouds are made of dust, and the sky is red with fire. He begins to stride carefully and slowly towards the front lines of the audience. And yet, in this place, where God's name is foreign, they practice strange magic, a witchcraft that seldom graces the Western world. But in my travels, I have stumbled on this swarthy man playing his tricks for scraps at a pub, and past his wrappings, there was a terrible power in those dark eyes. That power, that very same power, I bring to amaze and astound you tonight. And now I present the wonder himself, the mysterious, exotic, all-seeing Zoltan. Behind the stilt man, from the back of the wagon, emerges a man the likes of which I have never seen. His head is wrapped in black-purple cloth, so only his eyes and the bridge of his nose are visible. Thin strips of hair come through and hang around his face, further obscuring his eyes. And behind that curtain, a fire dances within him, brought to life in his pupils and shining like a cat's. As he moves, there is a slight jingling that brings me to think of a jeweler. The crowd laughs as he starts to circle around the fire, small chips of metal on his cloak catching the embers and sparkling like stars. He closes his eyes and walks so close to the flames I fear his clothes might catch. Take your seats, the stilt man insists, while Zoltan draws your names from the ether. The crowd dutifully sits on the ground or wherever is available, some in the dirt and some on stools. With a shaking hand, strong and dirty, graced with tarnished, bent rings on each finger, Zoltan reaches to his forehead and smooths the cloth back. When he takes his hand off, below it is an eye, painted red and purple, that glistens like grease in the flickering light. Zoltan starts making great motions with his hands, extended to the crowd like he really is pulling names out of people's heads. He takes deep breaths and the crowd chuckles at his theatrics. Get on with it, someone slurs. Quiet, the showrunner bites. This mastery takes time. Still, Zoltan weaks an eye open to glare at the offender, then goes back to his blind wandering. Eventually, he lands on one woman and puts both his hands on her head. The man with his arm around her seems to lean in to slap him off, but before he can, Audrey Smith, Zoltan announces. The lady looks around with a stupid smile on her face, her mouth agape. Hey, any girlie can have that. Zoltan points to the interruption. Nick Callahan! That shuts him up quick. Zoltan continues around the circle, either in order or singling someone out if they erupt. Padgrade Odelia, Fergus, Samuel, Jack Arbner, Edmund Vigna. He turns his name to someone milling around the back. You wouldn't like it if I said your name. The eyes turn and the man chuckles and waved a hand at Zoltan, confirming his suspicion. The crowd oohs, and soon people have forgotten all about the wager and are simply raising their hand, asking that Zoltan guess their name. Albert! And my wife's? Maurice! My daughter? Trick question, Zoltan states and turns away from him with some flair. She isn't born yet. Another round of pointing and naming. Aubrey, Elmer, Leon Fletcher. And that one, Zoltan seems to reach above the crowd to point at. Selma Bridgers! The crowd parts in their own sloppy, clumsy way, so that no one stands between myself and Zoltan. His finger unerring, his stance like a fancy swordsman, so that his side is to me, and his chin is turned up. Ho, ho, ho! The stilt man reminds me of his presence. A young girl has stumbled into our midst. And what are you doing up so late? I stand and stutter. Me? I... The stilt man strides up to me, he looking wildly off balance, and yet staying upright the full time until he is just in front of me. Even as he kneels to greet me, he is nearly twice my height. Little girl, you surely don't want to be one with this crowd of hooligans and ne'er-do-wells. Aren't ladies like you tucked in bed at this hour? I try to get a sound out, but he just continues. Oh, or would it be? He leans in close enough that I take a step back, but he pulls something out of his shirt pocket, his voice lowered. This. The smell. With him backlit by the fire, I couldn't make out the object he holds. But then he is standing and pacing back to the jeering crowd, upset that they were by the hooligan title. But where he goes, he leaves a trail, and I and the ant, follow the pheromone. I toddle forward, trying to keep up with him, and whatever he has in his hands, it seems the drunkards start to notice. More of the good stuff, one astutely observes. Didn't you run out? The stilt man doesn't respond, and Zoltan obediently relinquishes the spotlight. His glittering cloak the only giveaway of his presence behind the silhouettes of the crowd he began to circle. Ran out? There's always room for dessert. And we have a special guest now. Now, don't we? Once I am well within the boundaries of the audience, he leans down again, and I see that he is holding a single candied nut, like those I remember from Christmas. Just this? My eyes widen. Such a smell from so small a thing. But I must have it. My hand reaches out, and he gingerly places the candy into my palm. The audience boos my special treatment. The stilt man ignores them, only watching me chew. It is like nothing I've ever tasted, sweet beyond compare, to such a degree my teeth hurt. Its surface coats my mouth like a popped grape. Its juice is nutty and decadent and overwhelming. For a moment, I can only imagine that I have eaten that which belonged only to royalty, that I have stolen from some forbidden wealth and would soon be punished. but instead a warm feeling fills my body from head to toe. I feel my cheeks flush and my head fill with air. I nearly fall, but stick out a foot to catch myself. Whoa, the little lady has a little tolerance, doesn't she? The worlds swirl in my head like they are from another place, and everything left is taste. The colors in my world become coated with candy. The fire's rising smoke turned into a cottony pink cloud. The patchwork soup of the platform man dissolves into wild shapes that play and champ at each other. And when he speaks, the mouth sheds light like a jack-o'-lantern's. He grabs my arm to keep me on my feet, and then he shakes his head while somewhere far away, a mom craves the very candy he has given me. No more, he fends them off. She's a special guest. My daughter, my heavens, if I knew you would be so rowdy, I wouldn't have made her part of the act. I can't argue, because I haven't the head to tell if he's right or wrong. He lifts me up and puts me on his back, like he's protecting me from a pack of wolves. With my head so light, he feels like a mountain, like he is lifting me into the heavens. And I am at once afraid of the fall back down. I begin to mewl and moan as best as I can, with my world so distorted and my muscles so disobedient of my commands. And he seems to interpret this as my fear of the drunken fools. Well then, our act must be on the road at once. You people simply can't control yourselves. Toodaloo, and may we never meet again. He waves Zoltan over, who looks like a spattering of the cosmos itself. We all retreat into the wagon through the back. As we enter, the smell becomes more than mere scent, but the air itself. It's like we step into a sugar oven. The air is warm and intoxicating, so much so that I nearly faint. Ah, our little lady is heavy. Zoltan, lay out some sheets for her. And hair. Pull us out of here. We've collected our dues tonight. I don't want to remain for the aftermath. I moan, trying to get some kind of word to come out. Where are we going? I need to be home. But nothing happens. What's our change look like? Enough for a feast the next town over and a cleaning of Our Lady's hooves. Astounding, the stilt man says, placing me on some bench where I slump over immediately, only able to gently wave my hands outstretched in front of my face and watch the fingers turn from 10 to 20 to 30 until I blink the duplicates away. I feel something gentle and wooling cut me from my shoulders to my feet. There, Zoltan says. I close my eyes. Make it go away, I silently wish. Make it go away. Make it go away. My head spins no matter how much I will against it. Make this all go away. There, the salt man agrees. She can sleep the sugar off. Leave her be. Their voices start to get very far away. What do we do with her? Zoltan asks. There is a pause, or maybe I sleep out of consciousness for a second before I hear the response. Hare, find somewhere discreet for the night. Cricket song. Wet leaves on my left cheek. I'm lying down somewhere dark, light from the corners of my vision, my ears tuned to voice tones. An animal is so hard to train. Do you see what I'm saying? Some mumbles of agreement. I blink my eyes. My head is still light, but clearer. My mouth doesn't respond to my wants, and neither does the rest of my body. However, in what little wiggling I can accomplish, I quickly come against restraints. She's awake, some new voice says. Thank you, Hare. I never would have known. I hear steps. The warm night air meets with my flushing cheeks. I wriggle my jaw only to find my mouth is open, but there's something in it, tight around my head. I create some kind of sound, weak as it is, a moan or some such, up from my sternum. Well, any idea? The showrunner asks. Any other ideas? My ankles are bound and my wrists are tied behind my back. The dirt meets my skin from my temple to my feet. Fear starts to crowd out the lingering effects of the candy, and my muscles tense. I can see nothing but some shifting shadows from the flickering light of a lantern behind me. A toddler's squeal comes from my throat, and I start to fight hard against the restraints, only accomplishing a change in position, from my side to prone. All right. I hear the rubbing of two pieces of wood together. It appears I didn't hire conversationalists, did I? I start to find some kind of rhythm in squirming, which makes me gain ground against their voices. Progress, meaning direction. I start to move as fast as I can, like a little worm who's never been a worm before, pushing against the dirt and towards whatever else. A boot is shoved underneath my stomach and flips me onto my back. Above me, there is the stilt man, without his stilts. The traveling entertainer. A lantern from some other light source illuminates only the right side of his face, but his eyes catch some flick of the fire to give them orange glimmering pupils that stare down at me through the thick fog of terror and drug. You all lack vision, he says. He takes one deep breath and then crouches down. I try to wiggle away, but he places his hands on my shoulders and pushes me back into the earth, pinning me. His orange eyes spear through my head. I try my best to look away, but only when I close my eyes can I escape that awful gaze. He studies me like the men study meat at the butcher. Hello, you, he whispers, almost only breathes. For a moment, he only looks at me. I hear the shuffling of feet from somewhere. Above me to my right, there is a cough, and the entertainer looks up, his mustache catching on the light, hanging in the air with a perfect coil. Do you need help? Hare asks. Hmm? His eyes return to me. No, I'm just getting a sense of our newest addition. Selma. Hello, Selma. I'm Herman Fuller, and I get the sense that we are going to get along swimmingly. I'm giving you the opportunity to be part of something bigger, something grander, a spectacle for the world to see and love. Only we have to make you something lovable first. And well, that process isn't so easy. He holds something up to the lantern light that I can't quite make out. In other words, sorry for the gag, and you may feel a little pinch. I scream as the wooden blade goes through my right side and out the back. I scream again as the second one mirrors it, and both pin me to the forest floor. My vision swims, and my world loses itself to the shearing of my flesh and the pooling blood underneath my bare back. He stands above me, impassive, though I can hardly make him out past the tears pooling in my eyes. Zoltan, come here. He leaves my vision. Every motion, every straining of muscle only pulls at the wounds in my loins. The new orifice is leaking my lifeblood. I cry and screech, but the gag muffles my attempts. I hear some kind of physicality. Come here. I need you to be here for this. You aren't the first, Zoltan, and if you're lucky, you can be the last. Do you understand me? A pause. The crickets have ceased their calls to cede the stage to my suffering. Of course, he replies, too quiet. Progress is hard, Zoltan. Progress takes fucking effort. I thought you told me I have the heart for it. I thought you told me I have the gift. Now come here, Zoltan, and look at it. Look at progress. Look at it in the eyes. My cries redouble as the boot stomps the blade further into my side, sawing through tissue as it goes. Just you wait. One day, this will be a whole industry. Someone can be on the ground using their hands, and I'll call the shots. But you have to work hard to never work again. And the work? Oh, the work. He crouches down and rests both hands on the handles of the wooden knives, staring into my face of agony again. I'm not very practiced at growing fur. Selma, I declare that you will then be our fantastically intelligent pig. I think that will really sell on the flyers. Don't you? His fingers drum on the handles, and then he stands again. He breathes deep and pumps his arms back and forth. And a 1, and a 2, and a 3. He plummets his hands into my stomach with such force that I immediately vomit and begin to choke. He starts to mutter in some language I can't understand, not that I can listen for words, now that my mind is taken with the bile clogging my throat, preventing the passage of air from my nose to my lungs, burning in my esophagus. But his hand goes through my skin, like his arms and my guts have molded into one being. I begin to feel some things long and serpentine shoot out the point of impact beneath my skin, reaching into my extremities and into my hands and feet, one then coming through the meat of my neck and wrapping around to the back of my head. His muttering continues, and the blades begin to burn. My body changes. First, my belly expands. I swell like a balloon, starting with my stomach, but the bloat reaches up to my chest, then starts to blow through my neck. Once the transformation reaches my head, something worse begins to happen. My cheeks extend, and I can feel my bones stretch and break and reform and stretch again. The bridge of my nose pulls forward like a sapling reaching towards the sun, and my nose turns up at the end, where there forms a flat face. My eyes drift to the side of my head, and my ears pull up to the top. My cries start to change their tone, from garbled screams to squeals. My limbs pull at their restraints as their sockets stretch and their flexibility limits. My wrists break free, pulling in front of me as they're angled up towards the sky, and at their ends my fingers are encased together in new hooves, made from my expanding fingernails. My legs soon follow suit as the back end of my spine grows and pushes against my skin, fracturing and stretching and healing and fracturing again. As soon as it started, it stops. The tendrils whip back to their point of origin, and his hand pulls out of my putty-like stomach, which in their absence hardens into something closer to skin. He stands to full height and looks down at me, my still human eyes leaking tears from some new system I'm not familiar with, my stubby arms turned to legs waving in the air, my inhale snorting and squealing. He breathes heavily. Well, that was unpleasant. He brushes some dirt off his pants where he knelt on the ground. He turns to his compatriots. Eh? Looks like a pig? I hear some grunts of affirmation. I stop making noise and just lay there, breathing heavily, my lungs weighted by my new layers of fat. Everything feels wrong. Good. Maybe we can make it walk on 2 legs or do math. The fantastically intelligent pig. Let's think of a name on the ride. Here, go drag it into the wagon. It should be too tired to fight you. He's right. I don't have enough control of my body to fight him. Hare heaves my rotund figure with ease and carries me back into the cart. Along the way, the entertainer unties my gag and throws it to the ground, coated as it is in bile. They toss me in, and Hare goes around to the front. The cart begins to move as the entertainer and Zoltan sit on either side of me. I just lay and heave. How's this, Zoltan? Herman Fuller's precocious prancing pig, eh? The pause is pregnant. I like it, Zoltan replies. Herman takes one sharp breath, then reaches over me to pat Zoltan on the cheek. I knew you'd come around. Leans back in his seat and spreads his arms along the headrest, then takes his glittering eyes and looks down towards me. We'll all be big one day. You just wait and see. Like one big, happy family. He laughs careless, but no one joins him.